Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Utah desert stretched endlessly before me, a canvas of rust-colored earth beneath a sky so vast it seemed to press down on my skull. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, my hands cramping around the steering wheel, when the radio finally gave up its static-filled fight and died completely. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was hungry, swallowing the rumble of my engine and the whisper of wind through the cracked passenger window. That's when I saw them. At first, it was just a dark smudge against the shimmering heat waves rising from the asphalt. As I drew closer, the shape resolved into a car, an old sedan, maybe from the 80s, its faded blue paint job practically invisible against the desert backdrop. The hood was propped open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. I should have kept driving. Every instinct in my body, every primitive alarm bell inherited from ancestors who knew when to run from predators, told me to press harder on the accelerator and leave this scene in my rearview mirror. But the rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained by years of civilization and common decency, began to slow the car. 3 figures stood around the disabled vehicle. Even from a distance, something about their posture struck me as wrong. They weren't moving, not even the small, unconscious movements that mark living people. No shifting weight from foot to foot, no turning of heads, no gestures of frustration or conversation. They simply stood there, as still as mannequins in a department store window. I pulled over about 50 feet behind them, leaving my engine running. The desert air that rushed through my open door felt like opening an oven, dry and searing. My footsteps on the gravel shoulder sounded unnaturally loud in the absolute stillness, each crunch echoing off the endless horizon. "Need any help?" I called out. But my voice seemed to get swallowed by the heat before it could reach them. As I approached, the wrongness of the scene became more apparent. The 3 figures, 2 men and a woman, were dressed in clothing that looked somehow outdated. Not vintage or retro, but genuinely old, as if they'd been standing here for decades. The fabric looked faded by more than just sun exposure. It had the quality of something that had been slowly drained of life. Their skin had an odd waxy sheen to it, like candles that had begun to melt but then stopped. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring at points somewhere beyond the visible horizon. When I moved around them, trying to catch their attention, their gazes didn't follow. They remained perfectly, impossibly still. "Excuse me," I said, louder this time. One of the men was closest to me, middle-aged, with a mustache that belonged to the early 80s. I reached out to tap his shoulder. My hand passed through him, not through empty air, but through something that had the consistency of thick fog. Where my fingers should have met solid flesh, they encountered a cold, tingling resistance that sent a shock up my arm. The man didn't react, didn't even seem to notice that someone had just violated the physical laws of the universe by reaching into his body. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rational explanations started firing rapidly through my mind. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, hallucinations brought on by too many hours of desert driving. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew this wasn't a trick of an overheated brain. The woman turned her head toward me. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was definitely there. Her eyes, which had been staring at some point beyond the mountains, slowly shifted until they were looking directly at me. There was no recognition in them, no awareness of me as an individual. It was more like a plant turning toward sunlight, an automatic response to stimulus. Then she spoke, though her lips didn't move, and the voice seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "Car trouble," she said, the words hollow and echoing despite the open desert around us. "Been waiting for someone to stop." The other 2 figures began to turn as well, their movements synchronized like dancers responding to music only they could hear. The man with the mustache tilted his head in my direction. "Just need a jump start," he said in the same disembodied voice. "Won't take but a minute." I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to sprint back to my car and drive until I reached the next town, the next state, the next time zone. But something else held me there. A compulsion that felt foreign, as if it had been planted in my mind from outside. My feet carried me toward the open hood of their car despite my terror. The engine beneath was old but clean, as if it had been meticulously maintained right up until the moment it had stopped working. I found myself reaching toward the battery terminals, my hands moving independently of my conscious will. The moment my fingers made contact with the cold metal, a sound exploded inside my skull. It wasn't heard through my ears. It bypassed them entirely, resonating directly in the bone and tissue of my head. A deep, metallic grinding, like massive gears turning in slow motion. The sound had weight to it, pressing against the inside of my cranium with a force that made my vision blur. And with that sound came understanding. These weren't people. They were echoes, imprints left behind by 3 travelers who had stopped at this exact spot 40 years ago to help another stranded motorist. They had touched that driver's car, tried to help, and in doing so, had become trapped in a loop of time and space that turned them into bait for the next Good Samaritan. The knowledge came to me complete and terrible, as if it had been downloaded directly into my consciousness. I understood that if I continued trying to help them, if I allowed that metallic grinding to complete its cycle inside my head, I would join them. I would become another echo, another still figure standing beside this road, waiting for the next helpful driver to stop and perpetuate the cycle. The grinding sound was building, growing louder and more insistent. I could feel it starting its second revolution inside my skull, like a drill bit boring deeper into my brain. My hands remained frozen on the battery terminals, no longer under my control. The 3 figures had moved closer without my noticing. They surrounded me now, their empty eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that was both desperate and hungry. The woman reached out with one translucent hand, her fingers stopping just short of my cheek. "Stay," she whispered, and her voice had taken on a pleading quality. "It's not so bad once you stop fighting it. Time passes differently here. We've been talking for 40 years, getting to know each other. You'll like it." The man with the mustache nodded earnestly. "The loneliness is the worst part at first," he agreed. "But then someone always comes along eventually. Someone always stops to help." The third figure, a younger man I hadn't heard speak before, smiled with lips that never quite seemed to move properly. "And then they understand, just like you're understanding now. The cycle continues. The highway remembers." The metallic grinding was reaching a crescendo, preparing for its third and final turn. I could feel my body beginning to stiffen, my blood cooling in my veins. In a few more seconds, I would become like them, a solid echo of good intentions, frozen in time and space, waiting for the next victim. With a supreme effort of will, I forced my hands away from the battery terminals. The connection broke with an almost physical snap, and the grinding sound in my head faltered, like a record player with the power suddenly cut. The 3 figures looked at me with expressions of surprise and disappointment. I ran. My legs felt like they were moving through thick mud, each step requiring enormous effort. Behind me, I could hear the figures calling out, their voices growing more desperate and distorted. "Come back. You can't leave us. The highway remembers." I reached my car and threw myself behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar that sounded like salvation. I slammed the car into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor. In my rearview mirror, I watched the 3 figures grow smaller and smaller, still standing motionless beside their broken-down car. As the distance increased, they began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. Even the car itself seemed to shimmer and dissolve, leaving nothing but empty desert highway. I drove for 3 hours without stopping, not trusting myself to slow down until I reached the neon sanctuary of a truck stop outside Salt Lake City. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the restaurant, surrounded by the comfortable noise of normal people living normal lives, I almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by heat and isolation. Almost. But sometimes, Late at night when the world is very quiet, I can still hear that metallic grinding sound echoing faintly in the back of my skull. It's patient, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I know that somewhere out there, on a stretch of Utah highway that might not always be in the same place, 3 figures are standing beside an old blue sedan with its hood propped open, waiting for the next helpful driver to stop. The highway remembers, and the echo never truly ends. I've never driven that route again, but I've heard stories from other travelers. They describe a broken-down car that appears on different stretches of desert highway, always with 3 people standing beside it, always needing help. Most drivers pass by, their survival instincts overriding their good intentions. But some stop, and some are never seen again. The official reports always list them as missing persons, victims of the harsh desert environment. Search parties find no trace of them or their vehicles. The highway patrol assumes they took a wrong turn somewhere, got lost, ran out of gas in some remote area where the buzzards and coyotes erased the evidence. But I know better. They're still out there, standing beside that phantom car, waiting. The highway has claimed them, turned them into echoes of their own kindness. And the cycle continues, patient and eternal, fed by the one thing that desert roads have in abundance: the endless stream of travelers, alone and vulnerable, carrying within them that most dangerous of human traits, the desire to help a stranger in need. Sometimes I wonder if I really escaped at all, or if this is just another layer of the echo, another part of the trap. Maybe I'm telling this story to lure others to that stretch of highway, adding my voice to the call that draws good Samaritans to their fate. But that would mean the echo has grown stronger, evolved beyond simple physical manifestation into something that can reach across time and space through words and stories. It would mean that by writing this down, by sharing what happened to me, I'm helping to cast a wider net. The thought should terrify me, but lately it doesn't. Lately, when I hear that metallic grinding in the quiet moments before sleep, it almost sounds like a welcome song. Story 2. The joggers had all gone home by the time I laced up my running shoes that Tuesday evening. Central Park after dusk belonged to a different species of person. Those of us who preferred the cover of darkness. The solitude that only came when the park shed its daytime skin and revealed something more honest underneath. The lamplight carved irregular pools of yellow against the asphalt, and beyond their reach, the trees pressed in like curious spectators. I'd been running this same circuit for 3 years now. 7 miles, always 7 miles. In through the park entrance at 85th and Central Park West, around the reservoir, down through the Ramble, past the Alice in Wonderland statue, and back up the western side. The route had become as automatic as breathing, my feet finding their way even when my mind wandered to the reports I'd left unfinished at the office or the bills accumulating on my kitchen table. But that night, something felt different from the first step. The air seemed thicker somehow, pressing against my lungs with an unusual resistance. I attributed it to the humidity. October in New York could be unpredictable, but even as I fell into my familiar rhythm, the sensation lingered. My breathing felt labored earlier than usual, my heartbeat too loud in my ears. The park seemed unusually quiet too. No distant traffic hum, no scattered conversations from late evening walkers. Just the steady slap of my sneakers against the path and the whisper of wind through leaves that had begun their autumn retreat. I was about a mile in when I first heard them. Footsteps, not unusual in itself. The park attracted runners at all hours, but these footsteps matched my pace exactly. Not the natural synchronization that sometimes happened when 2 runners found a similar cadence, but a perfect mirror. When I sped up slightly to test a theory I couldn't quite articulate, the other runner accelerated at precisely the same moment. When I slowed, so did they. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing except the lamp-lit path stretching behind me. The footsteps continued, maintaining their eerie precision. I stopped altogether, hands on my hips, catching my breath while I listened. The sound ceased immediately. The silence that followed felt dense and expectant, as if the entire park were holding its breath. When I resumed running, so did my invisible companion. I tried to rationalize it. Echo, perhaps, though the park's layout made that unlikely. Maybe another runner wearing particularly soft shoes, staying just outside the range of the streetlights. But as I continued, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. There was no sound of breathing. When you run alongside someone, even at a distance, you hear the rhythm of their exertion, the huffing and puffing that comes with sustained movement. But all I heard were the footsteps, mechanically precise and utterly breathless. By the third mile, I'd convinced myself I was manufacturing the whole thing. Stress, probably. I'd been working too many late nights, drinking too much coffee, sleeping too little. The mind played tricks under those conditions. I'd read about auditory hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and anxiety. That had to be it. But then I saw the footprints. I'd stopped again near the reservoir, this time genuinely winded, and when I looked down at the gravel path where I stood, I noticed the impressions my running shoes had left in the loose stones. Fresh marks, clearly defined, leading back the way I'd come, but beside them, parallel to my own track, ran another set of prints. They were deeper than mine, as if made by someone heavier, or someone pressing down with unusual force. The shoe pattern was different too, an older style, with worn treads that left distinctive grooves in the gravel. I knelt and touched one of the prints. The impression was fresh, the displaced gravel still loose and crumbly. Whatever had made these marks had passed this way recently, very recently. My hands trembled as I stood. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Another runner had passed before me, following the same route. The prints just happened to parallel mine. Coincidence. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't hold up. I'd been watching the path ahead of me, and I would have seen someone. I started running again, faster this time, driven by a growing unease that I couldn't name. The footsteps resumed immediately, maintaining their perfect synchronization with my pace. But now I was watching the ground as I ran, and what I saw made my blood feel thick and cold in my veins. The prints were appearing as I watched, not all at once, but materializing in segments. First the heel impression, then the arch, then the toe, as if an invisible weight were pressing down step by step. The gravel shifted and compressed in real time, following a path that ran parallel to mine about 3 feet to my left. I veered right, moving closer to the tree line. The phantom prints adjusted their course accordingly, maintaining the same distance. When I moved left toward the reservoir, they shifted left as well. Whatever was making those impressions was definitely tracking my movement, responding to my changes in direction with unnerving precision. By the 4th mile, I noticed something else that chilled me more than the mysterious footsteps and phantom prints combined. The trees were wrong. I knew this route like I knew my own apartment. Every landmark, every turn, every cluster of benches and lampposts. But the trees seemed farther apart than they should have been. The familiar groves that usually pressed close to the path had receded, leaving stretches of open space that felt alien and exposed. The Alice in Wonderland statue, which should have appeared after the 4th mile marker, was nowhere in sight. I stopped running and pulled out my phone, intending to check my GPS. The screen showed no signal, unusual but not impossible in certain parts of the park. More troubling was the time display, 9:47 p.m. I'd started running at 8:30, which meant I'd been out for over an hour, but I'd only covered what felt like 4 miles, and even accounting for my slower pace and frequent stops, that didn't add up. When I looked around, I realized I didn't recognize where I was. The path continued in both directions, well lit and properly maintained, but the landscape around it had become unfamiliar. The trees stood at uniform distances, like soldiers in formation, their branches reaching toward a sky that seemed both too close and impossibly far away. The air felt different too, thinner somehow, despite the earlier sensation of thickness. Each breath required more effort, as if the atmosphere were slowly leaching away. I thought about turning back, retracing my route to find my way home. But when I looked behind me, the path stretched on just as endlessly as it did ahead. The lampposts marched into the distance in both directions, their light growing dimmer and dimmer until they disappeared into a darkness that seemed to swallow everything. The footsteps had stopped when I stopped, but I could feel a presence nearby. Not threatening exactly, but persistent, patient, like someone waiting for me to make a decision. I started running again, this time with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. I needed to find a landmark, something familiar that would help me orient myself. But the landscape continued to unfold in its strange uniformity. The same precisely spaced trees, the same well-maintained path, the same pools of lamplight that revealed nothing beyond themselves. It was then that I noticed the plaques. They were small, bronze markers set into stone posts that appeared at regular intervals beside the path. I'd never seen them before, but they looked official, like the historical markers you'd find in any public park. The first one I stopped to examine bore an inscription that made my stomach drop. In memory of Thomas Whitmore, marathon runner, 1876-1904, lost to the infinite mile. The next plaque, perhaps 50 yards farther along, contained similar text. In memory of Sarah Chen, distance runner, 1923-1957, still seeking the finish line. And the next, in memory of Robert Kowalski, track athlete, 1962-1989, running toward tomorrow. Each marker told the same basic story, runners from different eras who had somehow become lost in this place. The dates spanned over a century, but the message was consistent. They were all still here, in some sense. Still running. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Memorial plaques weren't unusual in public parks. Maybe this was some kind of dedicated section for deceased athletes. But I'd never heard of such a thing in Central Park, and the inscriptions themselves felt wrong somehow. Too poetic, too ominous. Official park memorials didn't usually reference people being lost or still seeking. As I continued running, the plaques appeared with increasing frequency. Soon I was passing one every 20 or 30 yards, their bronze surfaces gleaming in the lamplight like watch faces marking off time that refused to pass normally. The names and dates continued to vary, but the themes remained constant. Runners who had entered this place and somehow never left. I was deep into what should have been the 6th mile when I found the plaque that made me stop running altogether. In memory of Thomas Whitmore, marathon runner, 1876-1904. Died of exhaustion October 15, 1904, mile 23 of his final race, still running, still seeking a companion to complete the course. The name was the same as the first plaque I'd read, but this inscription contained more detail. October 15, 1904, mile 23. The date struck me as significant, though I couldn't immediately place why. I pulled out my phone to check the date, hoping the device might have regained signal. October 15th, today's date. The realization hit me like a physical blow. 120 years ago to the day, Thomas Whitmore had died somewhere in this park, 3 miles short of completing a marathon. And according to the plaque, he was still seeking a companion to complete the course. I looked around with new eyes, suddenly understanding what had been happening. The phantom footsteps, the materializing prints, the expanding distances between trees. This wasn't Central Park as I knew it. This was Thomas Whitmore's course, the endless mile that had claimed him in 1904 and had been claiming runners ever since. The footsteps resumed as soon as I started moving again, but now they felt different. Less like pursuit and more like invitation. Encouragement even. Whatever presence had been following me wanted me to continue, to push forward toward some goal that remained frustratingly undefined. I tried to calculate how far I'd run. The mile markers had disappeared sometime after the 4th mile, and my phone's GPS remained useless. But based on time and effort, I had to be approaching 7 miles, the distance of my usual circuit. In normal circumstances, I should have been nearing the park exit, ready to walk the few blocks home to my apartment and a hot shower. Instead, I found myself approaching another plaque, this one larger than the others, and set into an ornate stone monument that I definitely would have remembered if I'd ever seen it before. The inscription was longer too, etched in smaller text that forced me to lean in close to read. The Central Park Marathon Memorial Course. Established 1904 in honor of those who run beyond the finish line. Distance, 26.2 miles. Warning, Do not exceed mile 26 without proper preparation. The course extends infinitely beyond the official marathon distance. Runners who pass mile 26 without completing the full distance will be unable to exit the circuit. Below the warning, in smaller text, was a list of names and dates. Dozens of them, spanning the years from 1904 to the present. The most recent entry was dated just 3 months ago. I stared at the monument, trying to process what it implied. A 26.2-mile course within Central Park was impossible. The park simply wasn't large enough. But apparently Thomas Whitmore had discovered some version of the park that could accommodate such a distance, and in the century since his death, others had found their way onto the same course. The warning about mile 26 was clear enough. Pass that point without completing the full marathon distance, and you'd be trapped in an infinite loop, running forever through a version of Central Park that existed outside normal space and time. I checked my phone again, hoping for some indication of how far I'd traveled. Still no GPS signal, and the battery was draining faster than it should have been. But I noticed something else troubling. The time display had barely advanced. According to my phone, it was now 9:52 p.m., only 5 minutes later than the last time I'd checked, despite what felt like at least 20 minutes of running and reading plaques. Time was behaving as strangely as space in this place. I resumed running, now with a specific goal in mind: count my steps, calculate my pace, and stop before I reached mile 26. A marathon was 26.2 miles. I'd started with a 7-mile circuit and had probably covered about 8 miles by now, which meant I had 18 miles left before I reached the danger zone. At my normal pace, that would take roughly 2.5 hours. But as I ran, I began to suspect that normal calculations didn't apply here. The landscape continued to shift subtly around me, the trees advancing and retreating like a slow-motion accordion, the path curving in ways that defied my memory of Central Park's layout. Each mile felt simultaneously longer and shorter than it should have, as if distance itself had become elastic. The footsteps beside me maintained their steady rhythm, and I found myself oddly comforted by their presence. Whatever Thomas Whitmore had become, he didn't seem malevolent. Desperate, perhaps. Lonely, certainly, but not threatening. He was simply a runner seeking a companion, someone to help him complete the course that had claimed his life over a century ago. By what I estimated to be mile 15, I began to understand the true nature of my situation. This wasn't a supernatural occurrence in any traditional sense. It was more like a pocket of space-time that had been warped by a single moment of extreme determination and unfulfilled purpose. Thomas Whitmore had died so close to completing his marathon that his will to finish had somehow imprinted itself on the landscape, creating a space where that race could continue indefinitely. Other runners had been drawn into this space over the years, either by coincidence or by some mysterious attraction. Some had completed the course and presumably escaped. Others had exceeded mile 26 without finishing and had become permanent residents of Thomas's eternal marathon. The question now was which group I would join. I ran for what felt like hours, though my phone insisted that almost no time was passing. The plaques continued to appear at regular intervals, cataloging the runners who had found themselves on this course over the past century. Some of the inscriptions suggested successful completions, messages like "finished the race" or "found the exit." But many more indicated runners who had become trapped, their entries marked with phrases like "still running" or "seeking the finish line." As I approached what I calculated to be mile 20, I began to feel the physical toll of the extended run. My legs were heavy, my breathing labored. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the longest distance I'd ever covered continuously. But the strange physics of this place seemed to be sustaining me, providing just enough energy to continue without collapsing. The footsteps beside me had grown more distinct over the course of the run. I still couldn't see their source, but I could hear them more clearly now. The specific rhythm of worn running shoes against gravel, the slight scuff that suggested an older style of athletic wear. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that ran alongside my own. By mile 22, I was beginning to understand what had drawn Thomas Whitmore to attempt this marathon in the first place. There was something addictive about pushing beyond your normal limits, about discovering that your body could do more than you'd ever imagined. The pain of extended running gave way to a kind of euphoria, a feeling that you could continue indefinitely if you just kept putting one foot in front of the other. But I also understood the danger. This feeling of infinite capability was an illusion. Bodies had limits, and pushing beyond them could lead to collapse, injury, or worse. Thomas Whitmore had discovered that truth in 1904, and his determination to continue despite his body's limitations had somehow created this space where the running never had to end. As I approached mile 23, the point where Thomas had died, the atmosphere around me began to change. The air grew thicker again, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. The footsteps beside me became more pronounced, almost enthusiastic. Whatever presence had been accompanying me was excited about reaching this milestone. I passed a plaque marking the spot where Thomas Whitmore had collapsed and died. The inscription was simple: Mile 23, October 15, 1904. Here ended one race and began another. Beyond the plaque, the path stretched on into increasing darkness. The lampposts became more widely spaced, their light dimmer and more yellow. The trees had retreated so far from the path that they were barely visible, leaving me running through what felt like an endless tunnel of gray light. Mile 24 passed without fanfare, marked only by another small plaque that read, 2 miles to glory, 1 mile to danger. Mile 25 was accompanied by a more elaborate marker. The final mile approaches. Choose wisely. And then, as I crested a small hill that definitely hadn't existed in the Central Park I knew, I saw it in the distance. A finish line. It was strung across the path perhaps half a mile ahead, marked with the classic banner and timing equipment of an official marathon. Beyond it, the path seemed to fade into normal-looking parkland, with familiar trees and properly spaced streetlights. But I also saw something else that made my heart race with more than just exertion. Another set of markers, much smaller and easier to miss, indicated mile 26. The finish line was definitely beyond that point, maybe at mile 26.2, exactly the distance of a complete marathon. I had a choice to make. I could stop now, before reaching mile 26, and try to find my way back to the beginning of the course. The plaques I'd passed suggested that some runners had managed to escape by turning back before crossing into the danger zone. But there was no guarantee that the path behind me would lead anywhere except back to more running. Or I could continue forward, cross mile 26, and attempt to reach the finish line. If I succeeded, I might complete Thomas Whitmore's century-old marathon and free both of us from this endless loop. But if I failed, if I collapsed or gave up somewhere between mile 26 and the finish, I would become a permanent resident of this place. Just another name on just another plaque. The footsteps beside me had grown so distinct that I could almost see their owner. Thomas Whitmore, still running after 120 years, still determined to finish what he'd started. He wasn't trying to trap me here. He was offering me the chance to do what he'd been unable to accomplish alone. I could feel his hope and desperation radiating through the strange air of this place. He'd been waiting so long for someone strong enough, determined enough, to help him complete his race. All those other runners over the years, some had tried and failed, others had turned back in fear. But maybe I could be different. Maybe together we could finally cross that finish line and end this eternal marathon. I approached mile 26 with my heart pounding and my legs burning. The marker was larger than the others, decorated with warning symbols and text in multiple languages. The message was clear. Beyond this point, there was no turning back. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the path I'd traveled and forward at the finish line that beckoned in the distance. Thomas Whitmore's presence was strongest here, almost visible in the corner of my eye. I could sense his excitement, his gratitude, his desperate hope that finally, after more than a century, someone would help him complete his race. But I could also sense the danger. The space beyond mile 26 felt different, thinner somehow, less connected to the world I knew. If I entered that final stretch and failed to reach the finish line, I might never find my way back to my apartment, my job, my normal life. I might become another plaque, another warning for future runners who found themselves on Thomas Whitmore's impossible course. The rational choice was obvious. Turn back. find some way to retrace my steps, escape this place, return to the mundane safety of my regular 7-mile circuit. But as I stood there on the threshold, I realized that the rational choice might also be the coward's choice. Thomas Whitmore had been running alone for 120 years, trapped by his own determination and the cruel mathematics of distance. If I turned back now, he might wait another century for someone else to help him. I took a deep breath and stepped across the mile 26 marker. The change was immediate and dramatic. The air became so thin that each breath was a struggle. The path ahead stretched and wavered like a mirage, the finish line seeming to dance just out of reach. My legs felt like they were moving through thick liquid, each step requiring enormous effort. But beside me, Thomas Whitmore's presence became clearer than ever. I could see him now, not clearly, but as a kind of translucent figure in old-fashioned running attire. His face was gaunt with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with an intensity that had sustained him for over a century. He looked at me with gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. Together, we began the final stretch. The distance to the finish line seemed to fluctuate wildly. Sometimes it appeared to be only a few hundred yards away. Other times it receded into an impossible distance. My phone had stopped working entirely, the screen dark and unresponsive. I had no way to measure time or distance except by the burning in my lungs and the increasing weakness in my legs. But Thomas was there beside me, matching my pace, lending me strength I didn't know I had. When I stumbled, his presence steadied me. When I wanted to quit, his determination drove me forward. We were two runners separated by more than a century, united by the simple desire to complete something we had started. The finish line grew larger as we approached, its banner reading, Central Park Marathon, 1904-2024. The timing equipment looked both ancient and modern, as if it existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Beyond the line, I could see what looked like the real Central Park, the familiar landscape I knew, with properly spaced trees and normal streetlights. We crossed the line together, Thomas Whitmore and I, completing a race that had begun 120 years ago. The moment my feet touched the ground beyond the finish banner, the world shifted. The strange, endless version of Central Park collapsed like a soap bubble, replaced by the familiar pathways and landmarks I knew. I found myself standing near the park entrance at 85th and Central Park West, exactly where I'd started my run. According to my phone, which had somehow regained power and signal, it was 9:35 p.m., only 5 minutes after I'd begun running, but my legs ached with the exhaustion of having covered 26.2 miles, and my running shoes bore the evidence of that impossible distance. In my hand was something that hadn't been there before, a small bronze medal, warm to the touch, inscribed with the words, Central Park Marathon Finisher, 1904-2024, and the name, Thomas Whitmore. I looked around for any sign of the course I'd just completed, but saw only the normal park pathways. No plaques, no memorial monuments, no endless stretches of lamplight leading into darkness. Whatever space Thomas Whitmore had created through his century-long determination had finally been closed. I walked home slowly that night, my body tired, but my mind racing. Had I really run a supernatural marathon with a dead athlete? Or had I experienced some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion? The metal in my pocket felt real enough, its weight and warmth unmistakable. But the logical part of my mind insisted that what I remembered was impossible. I've continued running in Central Park, but I've never again encountered anything unusual. The circuit remains a familiar 7 miles, completed in roughly the expected time. I've looked for any historical record of Thomas Whitmore, but found no evidence that such a person ever existed. The medal has remained in my desk drawer, though I've shown it to no one. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when I'm running alone through the park, I think I hear other footsteps keeping pace with mine. But when I listen carefully, I realize they're just echoes. The sound of my own steps reflected off trees and lampposts, creating the illusion of company where none exists. Or so I tell myself. Because the alternative, that Central Park contains spaces that exist outside normal time and distance, places where the determined dead continue pursuing their unfinished goals. is too unsettling to accept. It would mean that any of us could find ourselves pulled into someone else's incomplete story, conscripted to help finish what they started. It would mean that the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we imagine, maintained only by our refusal to acknowledge what we cannot understand. It would mean that every step we take might be leading us somewhere we never intended to go. I keep running, though. Every night, same time, same route. 7 miles through Central Park, from entrance to exit and home again. Nothing unusual ever happens. But I've started carrying that bronze medal with me, just in case. Story 3. The phone's shrill cry cut through the November darkness of my Boston apartment at 11:47 p.m. I knew the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock, unable to sleep, grading papers that seemed to multiply like cancer cells under my red pen. The caller ID showed the school's main number. Professor Martinez? The voice crackled through static, distant and hollow. This is Jim, the night janitor. We've got a situation here at Blackwood Academy. Water's pouring through the ceiling in your classroom. Busted pipe from the floor above. Need you to come in and move your personal items before everything gets ruined. My stomach dropped. 3 months of lesson plans, family photos, my father's antique desk set. Everything sat vulnerable in that third-floor classroom. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, trying to place Jim's voice. In my 2 years teaching American literature at the academy, I'd only seen the janitor in passing, a thin shadow, pushing a mop cart through empty hallways. "How bad is it?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "Bad enough. Better hurry if you want to save anything." The line went dead. Boston streets lay slick with early winter rain as I drove through the financial district toward Beacon Hill, where Blackwood Academy perched like a Gothic monument to old New England money. The building dated back to 1892, though rumors persisted that it stood on much older foundations. Colonial-era structures that had housed everything from a meeting house to a private school for merchants' sons. At night, especially in weather like this, the academy looked less like an educational institution and more like something that belonged in a Hawthorne story. I pulled into the empty faculty parking lot, surprised to see every window blazing with light. The building stood illuminated against the dark sky like a beacon, every classroom glowing amber through rain-streaked glass. Strange, Jim had mentioned a water emergency, but if pipes had burst, wouldn't they shut off the electricity as a precaution? The main entrance stood unlocked. I pushed through the heavy oak doors into the lobby, and silence swallowed me whole. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty building, but something deeper, more complete, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The usual sounds that filled a school building were absent. No humming fluorescents, no settling of wood and metal, no distant whisper of ventilation systems. Just my footsteps echoing against marble floors laid over those mysterious colonial foundations. "Jim?" My voice bounced off vaulted ceilings and died. "Hello?" The elevator gaped open, waiting. I stepped inside and pressed 3, watching the brass needle sweep past each floor. But as the doors slid apart on the 3rd level, my breath caught in my throat. Every classroom door stood wide open, revealing neat rows of desks and pristine blackboards that gleamed like fresh tar. Not a single drop of water anywhere. The hallway stretched before me, perfectly dry, perfectly normal except for one impossible detail. Every blackboard in every visible classroom was completely new. Yesterday they'd been scarred with decades of use, scratched and stained and chalk-dusted. Tonight they looked like they'd been installed hours ago. I walked slowly toward my classroom, room 307, my shoes squeaking against polished linoleum. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the dead silence. Through each open doorway, I glimpsed those gleaming black surfaces, unmarked and waiting. Then the voice began. It emerged from speakers I couldn't see, crackling through the building's ancient PA system, with the hollow distortion of a gramophone recording. The tone was formal, measured, unmistakably that of an old-fashioned schoolmaster calling roll. Adams, Henry, present. Pause. Brennan, Margaret, present. Pause. Collins, Robert, present. I froze in the hallway, ice forming in my chest. The voice continued its meticulous recitation, calling names with the steady rhythm of a funeral bell. But these weren't my students' names. These were older names, formal names that belonged to another era. Fairfax, William, present. Pause. Goodwin, Eleanor, present. Each name echoed through empty classrooms, each pause filled with expectant silence, as if invisible students were indeed responding to their eternal roll call. The voice held a quality that made my skin crawl. Not quite human, but not obviously mechanical either. Something in between, like a recording of a man who'd spoken these names so many times they'd worn grooves in his throat. I reached my classroom and stepped inside. The new blackboard dominated the front wall, its surface so black it seemed to absorb light. But as I watched, pale lines began to appear across that darkness. Chalk marks forming without any hand to guide them. Letters assembled themselves in the cramped, precise handwriting of a Victorian schoolmaster. Lesson 1. The preservation of echoes. When voice becomes memory and memory becomes voice, the echo preserves what flesh cannot contain. The chalk moved with deliberate strokes, creating words that glowed briefly before fading to the dull white of old bone. New lines formed underneath. Every teacher who answers the night call leaves part of himself in these foundations. Every lesson taught after hours becomes eternal curriculum. My hands trembled as I backed toward the door. This was impossible. Chalk didn't move by itself. Voices didn't emanate from nothing. I was exhausted, stressed from the semester's pressure, probably having some kind of breakdown. That had to be it. But the PA voice continued its roll call, moving through what must have been hundreds of names. I caught fragments as I stumbled back into the hallway. Whitmore, Charles, present. Yardley, Constance, present. Names that sounded like they belonged on headstones in old Boston cemeteries. I checked the next classroom, 301. Another pristine blackboard, another set of invisible chalk marks appearing. Lesson 2. The weight of obligation duty calls the dedicated teacher even from warmth and safety. The building remembers every sacrifice, every late night, every moment of devotion beyond the call. In classroom 302, the chalk wrote, Lesson 3, the architecture of entrapment. In 305, Lesson 4, the students who never leave. Each room told part of a larger story, and with growing horror, I began to understand. The building wasn't just old, it was hungry. Every teacher who'd ever responded to an after-hours emergency, every dedicated educator who'd sacrificed personal time for their calling, had left something behind in these walls. And that something had accumulated over decades, growing stronger, more coherent, until it could reach out through phone lines and draw in new prey. The PA voice reached the end of its alphabetical recitation, then began again with obvious relish. And now, our newest addition to the permanent faculty. The static cleared, and the voice spoke with crystalline clarity. Martinez, David. Present. The words hit me like physical blows. That was my name echoing through empty halls, my identity being absorbed into whatever collective consciousness had taken root in Blackwood Academy's foundations. In every classroom I could see, chalk began writing simultaneously, covering blackboards with the same message repeated over and over. Martinez, David. Martinez, David. Martinez, David. I ran then, my rational mind finally surrendering to pure animal panic. But every classroom I passed showed the same thing. My name appearing in that old-fashioned script, claiming me, marking me as another permanent addition to the Academy's impossible faculty. The elevator doors stood open, but when I jabbed the lobby button, nothing happened. The brass needle remained frozen on 3. The stairs. I'd take the stairs. But when I pushed through the stairwell door, I found myself facing an impossible sight. Stairs that descended into absolute darkness, as if the lower floors had simply ceased to exist. I backed away from that hungry void and returned to the hallway, my breathing shallow and rapid. Every blackboard now displayed my name, dozens of iterations marching across each surface like ants claiming territory. The chalk continued writing, adding new lines beneath each instance of my name. Echo instructor, permanent faculty, always present. The PA system crackled to life again, but this time the voice was clearer, more familiar. With sick recognition, I realized it was my own voice speaking, reading from lesson plans I'd never written. The dedicated teacher never truly leaves his post. Even after flesh fails, the echo of his dedication remains, guiding future students through eternal curriculum. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voice came from inside my skull now, my own thoughts twisted into something alien and hungry. The building was claiming me piece by piece, converting my identity into just another layer of its accumulated consciousness. But then I noticed something. The chalk was still moving, still writing. If I could erase my name from every blackboard before what? The morning bell? Some arbitrary deadline that would seal my fate? It was insane, but in a situation where sanity had already abandoned ship, insane action felt like the only rational response. I grabbed an eraser from the nearest classroom and began scrubbing frantically at the blackboard. The chalk marks resisted, clinging to the surface like living things reluctant to die. Each stroke required tremendous effort, as if I were erasing not just chalk, but reality itself. Behind me, I could hear other blackboards continuing to fill with my name, the invisible chalk working faster now, urgency in its movements. Room by room, I fought against the academy's hunger, erasing my name again and again. But for every board I cleared, 2 more seemed to fill. The building was vast, and I was just one man with increasingly tired arms and growing desperation. The PA voice continued its commentary in my own twisted tones, describing lesson plans for courses that would never end, for students who existed only as echoes in colonial foundations. By the time I reached the final classroom on the 3rd floor, my hands were bleeding from gripping the eraser so tightly. The last blackboard held not just my name, but a complete biography. Birth date, education, teaching philosophy, even details about my family I'd never shared with anyone at the academy. The chalk was writing a complete record of David Martinez, preserving everything that made me human, so it could be filed away with all the other echo instructors. I erased it all, scrubbing until my arms screamed, and the blackboard gleamed empty and innocent once more. Then I collapsed into a student desk, gasping, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. The PA system crackled one final time, but now the voice was different. Older, more authoritative, like the building itself speaking. Temporary reprieve granted, but every night call answered strengthens the connection. Every late hour worked deposits obligation. The echo grows stronger with each visit. I stumbled toward the elevator, and this time the doors responded to my commands. The lobby felt like salvation, those oak doors like a gateway back to sanity. But as I pushed outside into the rain-washed night, I caught my reflection in the glass, and for just a moment, I looked transparent, as if the building had already claimed part of me. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Thank you for responding so quickly, Professor Martinez. Same time tomorrow night? I drove home through empty streets, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But when I reached my apartment, I found my desk drawer open, my red pen still uncapped, and a stack of papers I didn't remember grading. At the top of each page, in my own handwriting, was a note I definitely hadn't written. Excellent work. Please see me after class for extra credit assignment. The papers were blank except for those notes. Every single one. I locked the drawer and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside my window, Boston's lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere among them, Blackwood Academy waited with patient hunger. Tomorrow night, or the night after, or the night after that, my phone would ring again. The building would invent another emergency, another reason for a dedicated teacher to abandon the safety of home. And each time I answered that call, I'd leave a little more of myself in those colonial foundations, until finally there would be nothing left but an echo of David Martinez, teaching eternal lessons to students who existed only in the building's hungry memory. The truly terrifying part wasn't the supernatural architecture or the impossible physics of rooms that existed outside normal space. It was the growing certainty that I would answer when the phone rang again. Because that's what dedicated teachers do. We respond to our calling, even when that calling comes from the darkness beyond reason. Even when we know it's going to devour us one lesson at a time. Story 4. The taste of stale cigarettes and industrial carpet cleaner clung to my tongue when I first stirred in that godforsaken room. My watch read 3:17 a.m., its green glow the only certainty in a space that felt fundamentally wrong. The wayward motel had seemed like any other roadside sanctuary when I'd pulled in 12 hours earlier. Neon vacancy sign, stuttering against the desert darkness. The kind of place that existed purely for the exhausted and the desperate. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, fleeing a marriage that had crumbled in spectacular fashion and a job that had consumed what remained of my soul. The Route 66 stretch through Arizona promised anonymity and distance, two things I desperately needed. The desk clerk, a woman with hollow eyes and yellowed teeth, had handed me a key attached to a plastic cactus without meeting my gaze. Room 23, she'd mumbled, pointing down a corridor that seemed to stretch longer than the building's exterior had suggested. Now, in the pre-dawn stillness, something was fundamentally different. The door handle turned freely in my grip, but the door itself refused to budge. Not locked, stuck, as if the frame had warped overnight. More unsettling was the complete absence of sound from outside. No highway traffic, no distant truck engines, not even the whisper of desert wind. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. I moved to the window, expecting to see my dusty Honda Civic parked beneath the flickering neon. Instead, I found myself staring into another corridor identical to the one I'd walked down hours earlier. Same industrial carpet with its abstract pattern of browns and oranges. Same brass wall sconces casting sickly yellow light. Same numbered doors stretching into shadowy distance. But this corridor ran perpendicular to where the parking lot should have been. The impossibility of it made my stomach lurch. I pressed my face against the glass, searching for some logical explanation. Perhaps this was the back of the motel, and I'd simply lost my bearings in the darkness. But the corridor stretched in both directions as far as I could see, and each door bore the same brass numbers I remembered from my walk to room 23. I tried the door again, throwing my shoulder against it. The impact sent vibrations through the walls that seemed to travel much farther than they should have, as if the building itself was vastly larger than I'd perceived. The sound echoed back to me changed, distorted into something that resembled knocking from the other side. That's when I heard the voice. It drifted down from the ceiling vent, so faint I initially mistook it for the building's ventilation system, but the rhythm was wrong for mechanical noise, and as I stood perfectly still, I could make out the cadence of human speech. The words were indistinct, muffled by metal and distance, but the tone carried decades of weariness. "Hello?" I called up to the vent, feeling ridiculous. The voice stopped. Then, clearer now, came a response that made my skin crawl. "New fish," it said, and there was something like laughter in those words, though it sounded more like rust scraping against metal. "Haven't heard a new voice in... Christ, what year is it?" I told him it was 2025, and the silence that followed stretched so long I wondered if I'd imagined the entire exchange. When the voice returned, it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. 43 years, it whispered. 43 goddamn years. The man's name was Harold, or had been when such things mattered. He'd been a traveling salesman in 1982, hawking vacuum cleaners across the Southwest when his wife left him for his brother. Like me, he'd sought solace in the endless highway. And like me, he'd found the wayward motel when desperation and exhaustion had stripped away his better judgment. Harold's voice emerged from the vent in fragments. as if the words themselves were being filtered through layers of time and metal. He explained that the motel was unlike anything in the natural world, a structure that existed in the spaces between spaces, feeding on the disorientation and despair of travelers who'd lost their way, in more than just the geographical sense. "It moves the rooms," Harold told me, his words punctuated by what sounded like decades of accumulated rust in his throat. "Every time you cross a threshold, everything shifts, like one of them puzzle cubes my nephew used to play with. The building rearranges itself, keeping you lost, keeping you moving in circles that ain't really circles at all." I wanted to dismiss his words as the ravings of someone who'd clearly lost his mind, but the evidence surrounded me. The window that should have overlooked a parking lot now revealed an impossible corridor. The door that had opened easily 12 hours ago now refused to budge from its frame. Harold told me about others who'd become lost in the motel's shifting geometry. Salesmen and runaways, truckers and drifters, all drawn by the promise of a simple night's rest and trapped by forces they couldn't understand. Some had been there for decades, their voices occasionally drifting through the ventilation system like ghosts in the machine. Others had simply vanished, their rooms found empty but somehow still occupied, as if their presence had been absorbed into the building's hungry structure. "But there's a way out," Harold continued, and for the first time, his voice carried something resembling hope. "Heard it on the radio, first night I was here. Old country song, something about numbers and sequence. The DJ said it was about a trucker who'd gotten lost on a highway that wasn't on any map, but found his way home by following the numbers. Room numbers, I figured out later. Get the sequence right, walk through the doors in the right order, and the building has to let you go." The radio in my room crackled to life as if summoned by Harold's words. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of long-dead broadcasts. News reports from decades past, advertising jingles for products that no longer existed, and beneath it all, the ghostly remnants of country music that seemed to echo from some impossible distance. I spent the next hour trying to force the door, examining every inch of the window frame, even attempting to pry open the vent grate to reach Harold's corridor. Nothing yielded. The room had become a perfect prison, sealed from the outside world by forces that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. It was during my fourth examination of the door that I noticed it, a subtle change in the light beneath the gap. The corridor beyond was no longer the one I'd walked down the night before. The carpet pattern was different. The wall color had shifted from beige to a sickly green, and I could swear the spacing between the doors had changed. Harold had been right. The building was alive, constantly reshaping itself like some massive puzzle box with no solution. I pressed my ear to the door and heard what I'd somehow missed before. Footsteps, not the measured pace of someone walking with purpose, but the shuffle of someone who'd been walking the same corridors for far too long. The steps grew closer, paused directly outside my door, and then continued past with a sound like sandpaper against wood. "Don't try to follow the other guests," Harold warned when I described what I'd heard. "They ain't guests anymore, not really. They're part of the pattern now, walking their assigned routes, keeping the whole thing moving. You follow them, you become them." The radio continued its ghost song, fragments of melody that seemed familiar but remained just beyond recognition. I found myself straining to catch the lyrics, certain they contained the sequence Harold had mentioned. But every time I thought I'd grasped a line, the static would surge, swallowing the words in white noise. Hours passed, though my watch seemed to move independently of any natural rhythm. Sometimes the minute hand would race forward in sudden jumps, sometimes it would crawl backward, and occasionally it would stop entirely while the second hand continued its relentless circuit. I dozed fitfully in the chair beside the window, jerking awake each time the building shifted around me. And it did shift. I could feel it in the subtle changes in air pressure, in the way shadows fell differently across the floor, in the almost imperceptible tremor that ran through the walls like a heartbeat. During one of these shifts, I realized the window now looked out onto a different corridor entirely. This one was darker, its walls covered in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating the illusion of depth where there should have been only flat surface. A figure moved through that corridor, and my breath caught in my throat. It was human in shape, but wrong in every detail that mattered. Its movements were too fluid, as if its joints bent in ways that human anatomy couldn't accommodate. When it turned its head toward my window, I saw that its face was perfectly blank. No features at all, just smooth skin the color of old parchment. I stumbled backward from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure paused, tilted its head in what might have been curiosity, and then continued its impossible walk down the impossible corridor. "You saw one of them," Harold observed when I managed to stammer out what I'd witnessed. "The building's workers, I call them. They maintain the pattern, keep everything moving the way it's supposed to. Don't look too long. They don't like being watched." The radio sputtered back to life, and this time the signal was clearer. A country song emerged from the static, sung in a voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. The melody was mournful, telling the story of a traveler lost on a highway that existed between the maps, guided home by a sequence of numbers that appeared like breadcrumbs along his path. I grabbed the notepad from the nightstand and scribbled down every number I could catch from the lyrics. Room numbers, mile markers. The digits seemed to flow together in a pattern that was almost mathematical in its precision. The song mentioned 23, my current room, early in the sequence, followed by 7, 15, 91, and others that faded in and out of the static. When the song ended, the radio fell silent except for a low hum that seemed to emanate from the building itself. But I had enough. The sequence was incomplete, but it was a start. I approached the door again and found it had changed. The handle now turned freely, and when I pulled, it opened onto yet another corridor. This one was brighter. Its walls painted a cheerful yellow that looked obscene in the context of my situation. The doors stretched away in both directions, and I could see the number 7 clearly marked on a door perhaps 50 feet to my left. I stepped across the threshold. The sensation was immediate and nauseating, like stepping off a moving walkway while the world around you continued to slide. The room I'd just left vanished behind me, replaced by solid wall. When I turned back, there was no door, no room 23, just an unbroken expanse of yellow paint. The corridor I now stood in felt different from the one I'd observed through the window. The air was thicker, tinged with the smell of old coffee and desperation. The fluorescent lights buzzed with an irregular rhythm that made my teeth ache. Room 7 was identical to room 23 in every detail except the number on the door. Same brown carpet, same industrial furniture, same sense of wrongness that permeated everything. But the window now looked out onto a third corridor, this one carpeted in deep red and lined with doors that bore no numbers at all. I tried to retrace my steps, but the corridor had changed again. Where room 23 should have been, I found only room 7 repeated endlessly in both directions, like a hall of mirrors reflecting the same impossible space. Harold's voice found me again through the ventilation system, though it seemed more distant now, filtered through additional layers of metal and impossibility. "Keep following the sequence," he urged. "Don't try to go back. The building doesn't like backtracking. It gets angry." As if summoned by his words, the lights in the corridor began to flicker in patterns that hurt to watch. The fluorescent tubes strobed faster and faster until they were creating shapes in the air, symbols that seemed to write themselves in afterimages across my retinas. I ran toward the far end of the corridor, my footsteps echoing with a sound like breaking glass. Room 15 waited for me there, its door standing slightly ajar. I pushed through without hesitation. The next corridor was wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process. The walls curved in directions that shouldn't have been possible, and the doors were arranged in spirals that seemed to extend both up and down beyond the reach of my vision. Room 91 was somewhere in that maze, but finding it would require navigating a geometry that belonged in fever dreams rather than the physical world. I climbed what I hoped was upward, following a spiral of doors that might have been arranged by someone who'd never seen a normal hallway. The numbers followed no logical sequence. I passed room 344, then 12, then 1097, then 3. Some doors stood open, revealing spaces that were clearly larger than the building could contain. Others were sealed with what looked like industrial rivets. as if whatever was inside had been deemed too dangerous to release. Room 91 finally appeared at the end of a corridor that seemed to fold back on itself like origami. When I opened the door, I found myself back in room 23, but it wasn't quite the same room I'd started in. The window now looked out onto a parking lot where a single car sat beneath a stuttering neon sign. My Honda Civic, covered in dust and age, as if it had been sitting there for decades rather than hours. The radio crackled one final time, and the country song returned, clearer now than it had ever been. The voice sang about a traveler who'd found his way home by following the numbers. But in the final verse, it revealed a darker truth. The traveler had never truly left the highway at all. He'd simply learned to navigate its endless curves, becoming part of the pattern that trapped others who'd lost their way. I understood then that Harold had been both right and wrong. There was an escape sequence, but it wasn't an exit. It was a promotion. Follow the numbers correctly, and you didn't leave the Wayward Motel. You became one of its operators, one of the voices in the vents, guiding new arrivals through the same impossible maze you'd learned to navigate. The door handle turned easily in my grip. Beyond it lay the familiar corridor, now empty except for the soft shuffle of footsteps in the distance. My footsteps, I realized, as I began the walk that would take me to the next lost traveler, who'd seek refuge in a place that existed in the spaces between spaces. The sequence was complete, but the pattern was eternal. And somewhere in the building's vast network of corridors and rooms, a new voice would soon emerge from a ventilation grate, telling the next desperate soul about the numbers in an old country song, about escape routes that led only deeper into the maze, about the terrible mathematics of hope and despair that kept the Wayward Motel alive and hungry for new guests who'd lost more than just their way. The highway stretched endlessly in all directions, and I had finally learned to call it home. Story 5. The city died at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact moment because I was staring at my laptop screen when everything went black. Not the gradual dimming of a dying battery, but the absolute instantaneous death that only comes when the grid itself surrenders. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise civilization actually makes, and how wrong it feels when that noise stops. My loft occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Northern Liberties, Philadelphia's attempt at industrial chic. The exposed brick walls and steel beams that had seemed so authentic in daylight now felt like the bones of some massive dead thing. Through the skylight above my living area, I could see the storm clouds that had been threatening all evening, pregnant with the kind of electrical charge that makes your teeth ache. That's when I noticed them. Floating above the city like jellyfish in a dark ocean, spheres of light drifted between the buildings. They weren't the harsh white of street lamps or the warm yellow of apartment windows. This was something else entirely. A pale, shifting luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, each orb roughly the size of a basketball, moving with purpose through the storm-thick air. I pressed my face against the skylight glass, my breath fogging the surface as I watched more of them emerge from the clouds. Dozens, maybe hundreds. They moved in loose formations, some clustering around the taller buildings downtown, others weaving through the narrow streets like they were searching for something. The first reflection appeared in my television screen. I caught it in my peripheral vision. A figure seated on my couch, perfectly still, hands folded in its lap. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun around, but the couch was empty. Just the impression my body had left in the cushions from earlier in the evening. When I looked back at the dark TV screen, the figure was gone. My mouth felt dry as cotton. I told myself it was just the stress of the blackout, the disorientation of losing power during a storm. The mind plays tricks in darkness. Everyone knows that. But when I moved toward the kitchen, hunting for the emergency flashlight I was sure I'd left in one of the drawers, I saw myself again. This time in the chrome surface of my refrigerator. My reflection stood motionless in the metallic sheen, arms hanging at its sides, while I rummaged through the drawer. I stopped moving, but my reflection didn't. It continued to stand there, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The features were mine, The slightly crooked nose from a childhood fall, the scar above my left eyebrow, the stubble I'd been meaning to shave for 3 days. But the expression was wrong. Too calm, too knowing. I closed the drawer slowly, keeping my eyes on the refrigerator surface. My reflection finally moved, mimicking my actions with a half-second delay that made my skin crawl. When I raised my hand to touch my face, it raised its hand too, but the fingers seemed to linger in the air a moment longer than they should have. The flashlight was in the third drawer down. Its beam cut through the darkness like a knife, harsh and reassuring. I swept it across the loft, checking corners, confirming that I was alone. The light caught the various surfaces scattered throughout my space: the microwave door, the bathroom mirror, the glass of the framed prints on the walls. Each reflection seemed normal under the direct illumination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all watching me when I wasn't looking. I tried to remember what Dr. Martinez had said about stress responses, how the brain, when overwhelmed, can manufacture experiences that feel completely real. Auditory hallucinations were common during periods of extreme anxiety. Visual distortions too. The blackout, the strange lights outside, the isolation. It was a perfect storm for psychological breakdown. But that's when I heard the typing. Soft, rhythmic clicks coming from the direction of my desk. The laptop was closed, had been since the power died, but the sound was unmistakable. The specific pattern of fingers moving across keys, the occasional pause, the resumption of work. I crept toward the desk, flashlight beam dancing ahead of me, and saw that the laptop was indeed closed. The typing continued. With trembling fingers, I opened the screen. The battery was dead, the display black, but I could swear I felt warmth emanating from the keyboard. Not the heat of active electronics, but something else, something that reminded me of body temperature. I backed away from the desk, nearly tripping over the coffee table in my haste. The typing stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse than the impossible sound had been. At least the typing had given me something to focus on, a concrete puzzle to solve. Now there was nothing but the darkness and the growing certainty that I was not alone in my loft. My phone was useless. No signal. Battery at 12% and dropping fast without the ability to charge. But before it died completely, I managed to pull up a browser and search for any information about power outages in Philadelphia. The last cached results painted a confusing picture. Reports of widespread blackouts across the East Coast, all coinciding with increased solar activity. But buried in the search results was something else. A series of forum posts about something called the conscious blackout. The posts were fragmented, incomplete, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. During major geomagnetic storms, certain individuals reported experiencing what they described as a parasitic electrical consciousness that fed off reflective surfaces during power outages. The entity, if that's what it was, allegedly mimicked the appearance and behavior of those it observed, growing stronger with each reflection until it could maintain independent existence. The final post I managed to read before my phone died contained a single piece of advice. Break the reflections before the power returns. Crystal refracts and disperses. It's the only thing that works. I thought about the prism. It was part of a small collection of crystals and minerals I'd inherited from my grandmother, items I'd dismissed as New Age nonsense but kept for sentimental reasons. The prism was sitting on a shelf in my bedroom, roughly the size of my palm, its faceted surface designed to split white light into component colors. But reaching the bedroom meant crossing the length of the loft, past the bathroom mirror, past the kitchen appliances, past every reflective surface where my doppelganger might be waiting. I could feel it watching me from multiple angles now, a sensation like ice water trickling down my spine. Every time I turned the flashlight toward a reflective surface, I caught glimpses of movement that stopped just as the beam arrived. The journey to the bedroom felt like walking through a funhouse designed by someone with an intimate knowledge of my deepest fears. Each step was measured, deliberate, with constant glances over my shoulder. In the bathroom doorway, I made the mistake of looking directly into the mirror. My reflection was brushing its teeth. I wasn't holding a toothbrush. My mouth was closed. hands at my sides. But in the mirror, my doppelganger moved the brush in slow, methodical circles, foam building at the corners of its mouth. When I stepped closer, transfixed by the impossibility of what I was seeing, my reflection stopped and smiled. It was my smile, but stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. I ran the remaining distance to the bedroom, flashlight beam wild and erratic, casting crazy shadows on the walls. The prism was exactly where I'd left it, sitting between a piece of amethyst and a chunk of fool's gold that had always reminded me of my grandmother's laugh. I grabbed it and immediately felt its weight, solid and reassuring in my palm. Through the bedroom window, I could see the spherical lights growing brighter, descending from the storm clouds like luminous snow. They moved with increasing urgency now, clustering around buildings, some actually passing through windows as if the glass was merely a suggestion. One of them drifted past my window, close enough that I could see its interior, a swirling mass of what looked like electrical synapses, firing in patterns that seemed almost organic. Behind me, I heard movement. Not footsteps exactly, but the subtle sound of weight shifting, fabric rustling. I turned, raising the flashlight, and saw myself standing in the bedroom doorway. Not a reflection this time, but a three-dimensional figure that matched my height, my build, my facial features with uncanny precision. It wore the same clothes I was wearing, but they seemed somehow more substantial, as if they were made of light given weight and texture. The doppelganger tilted its head, studying me with eyes that were definitely mine, but held an intelligence that felt foreign. When it spoke, the voice was mine too, but the words came from somewhere else entirely. "You can't stop what's already begun," it said, and the sound of my own voice speaking words I hadn't chosen made my hands shake. "Every reflection, every surface, I'm already there. When the power returns, when the lights come back, you'll be the reflection." I raised the prism, and immediately the entity took a step backward. Where the faceted crystal caught the flashlight beam, rainbows scattered across the walls, breaking the white light into its component parts. The doppelganger's form wavered, becoming translucent in the scattered spectrum. "Crystal disrupts the cohesion," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "You can't maintain form when the light fractures." The entity that wore my face hissed, and sound no human throat should make, and retreated further into the living area. I followed, keeping the prism raised, sweeping the flashlight beam through its faceted surface. Wherever the broken light touched reflective surfaces, the images within them shattered like kaleidoscopes, showing dozens of fractured versions of myself before dissolving entirely. But the effort was exhausting. My flashlight beam was growing dimmer, the battery dying. In the weakening light, I could see the doppelganger growing more solid, more real. Outside, the spherical lights had descended to street level, and through the skylight I could see the storm clouds beginning to part. The power would return soon. I could feel it in the air, that electric tension that precedes the restoration of the grid. Streetlights would flicker back to life. Apartment windows would glow with television screens and computer monitors, and somewhere in the electrical surge, the entity would complete its transition from reflection to reality. I thought about the forum post again. Break the reflections before the power returns. But what if breaking them wasn't enough? What if the only way to ensure the entity couldn't return was to eliminate all reflective surfaces permanently? Moving with desperate efficiency, I began systematically shattering every mirror, every piece of glass, every metallic surface in the loft. The bathroom mirror exploded into a spiderweb of cracks under my flashlight handle. The microwave door caved inward when I struck it with a heavy book. The chrome fixtures in the kitchen bent and scratched under my assault. With each surface I destroyed, the doppelganger grew fainter, its form losing cohesion. But it also grew more frantic, moving around the loft's perimeter like a caged animal, always staying just outside the range of the prismatic light. "You're destroying yourself," it said, its voice now carrying a static quality, like a radio losing its signal. "Every reflection you break is a piece of who you are. Without them, how will you know you exist?" The question hit deeper than I expected. In the chaos of the past hour, I hadn't looked at myself directly, hadn't confirmed my own reality, except through the mirrors and surfaces I was now systematically destroying. What if the entity was right? What if reflections were how consciousness confirmed its own existence? But I couldn't stop. The air outside was clearing, and I could see the first streetlight flickering in the distance. The power grid was awakening, bringing with it the electrical current that would feed the entity's transition from parasitic reflection to independent existence. The final surface was the skylight above, a large pane of glass that reflected the interior of the loft like a dark mirror. It was too high to reach directly, but I could throw something at it. The prism itself was heavy enough to crack the glass, but using it that way would mean losing my only defense against the entity. The doppelganger seemed to sense my dilemma. It moved closer, its form solidifying as the streetlights below began their stuttering return to life. The resemblance was perfect now, down to the way I unconsciously favored my right foot when standing, the slight asymmetry in my shoulders from years of carrying a laptop bag. "You can't win," it said with my voice, and I almost believed it. "I am you, but better, stronger, more real than you've ever been." The lights in the building across the street flicked on, washing my loft in reflected illumination. In that moment, seeing the entity standing there with my face, my voice, my mannerisms, I understood the real horror of the situation. It wasn't that something alien was trying to replace me. It was that something that was indistinguishably me was trying to become more real than I was. I threw the prism. It struck the skylight with a crystalline chime, spiderwebbing the glass but not breaking it completely. The fractured surface caught the light from outside, splitting it into hundreds of tiny rainbows that danced across the loft's interior. Where the prismatic light touched the doppelganger, it fragmented like a broken mirror, showing dozens of slightly different versions of myself before dispersing entirely. But as the entity dissolved, I felt something else happening, a loosening sensation, as if something essential was being pulled away from me. The fragments of light that had been the doppelganger swirled through the air, some escaping through the cracked skylight, others seeming to fade into nothingness. The power returned with a sudden hum, filling the loft with the familiar sounds of electricity. The refrigerator's compressor kicking in, the cable box blinking to life, the laptop's charging indicator glowing green. Normal, comforting sounds that should have brought relief. Instead, they brought doubt. I moved to the bathroom, where the shattered mirror showed only fractured glimpses of my face. In the kitchen, the damaged microwave door reflected nothing but darkness. Every surface I'd destroyed in my panic now showed me only broken pieces of reality, fragments that didn't quite add up to a whole. I tried to remember what I'd looked like before the blackout started. The basic features came easily enough. Brown hair, brown eyes, average height. But the details were slipping away. The exact shape of my nose, the pattern of freckles on my arms, the way my smile looked when it was genuine versus when it was forced. Without reflections, how do you confirm you exist? The question echoed in my mind as I stood in my restored loft, surrounded by the debris of broken mirrors and shattered surfaces. Outside, the spherical lights had vanished with the storm, leaving only the normal illumination of a city that had survived another night. Everything was back to normal, except for the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed. I found a small piece of unbroken mirror, a shard that had somehow escaped my rampage. In its surface, I saw a face that was probably mine, but seemed somehow unfamiliar. The features were right, but the expression was wrong. Too calm, too knowing, like it had been waiting for me to notice. I dropped the shard, hearing it shatter against the floor. In the silence that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the city, in another loft or apartment or office building, someone else was looking into a mirror and seeing my face looking back. Someone who had spent the blackout breaking reflections and destroying surfaces, convinced they were fighting off a parasitic entity. Someone who might be more real than I was. The laptop chimed with an incoming email. The sender was listed as my own address, but I hadn't sent anything. The subject line contained a single word: welcome. I didn't open it. Outside, the first rays of dawn were beginning to pierce the storm clouds. The city was waking up, its inhabitants checking their phones and surveying the damage from the night's electrical disturbance. Most would find nothing more serious than reset clocks and dead batteries. But somewhere in Philadelphia, others like me were staring into mirrors and wondering if the face looking back was really their own. The conscious blackout was over, but its effects would linger, spreading through reflections and electrical impulses, propagating itself through the grid of modern life. I turned away from the window and tried not to think about how my shadow fell wrong against the wall, or how my footsteps seemed to echo with a rhythm that didn't match my movement. There would be time later to figure out what was real and what wasn't, if there was a difference anymore. Story 6. The salt air cut through my lungs like broken glass as we descended the narrow trail toward the isolated stretch of Muir Beach. Behind me, Marcus complained about the weight of his backpack while Sarah's laughter echoed off the cliff walls, too bright, too forced for this desolate place. The Pacific stretched endlessly before us, its gray waters churning under a sky that couldn't decide between dusk and storm. We'd chosen this spot specifically for its remoteness. No tourists, no rangers, no one to question our impromptu bonfire on a beach that technically closed at sunset. The kind of place where cell towers didn't reach, and the only sounds were waves against stone and wind, through the sparse vegetation clinging to the bluffs above. The beach itself felt wrong from the moment our feet touched the sand. Not wrong in any way I could articulate. The temperature was mild for October, the tide was low, and the scattered driftwood would make perfect kindling. But something in the way the shadows fell, or maybe how the waves seemed to whisper rather than crash, made the hair on my neck stand rigid. "This place gives me the creeps," Marcus muttered, echoing my thoughts as he dropped his pack near a natural windbreak formed by two large boulders. His voice carried strangely here, seeming to bounce off surfaces that shouldn't exist. Sarah was already gathering wood, her movements mechanical, almost compulsive. She'd been different since we'd started the hike down, quieter, more focused on something I couldn't see. When I asked if she was okay, she'd simply nodded and continued walking, her eyes fixed on the shoreline as if searching for something specific. The bonfire took shape quickly. We'd done this dozens of times before at other beaches, but tonight felt different. The flames seemed reluctant to catch, requiring more lighter fluid than usual, and when they finally took hold, they burned with an odd blue tinge at the edges. The smoke rose straight up despite the coastal breeze, forming a pillar that disappeared into the darkening sky. That's when we heard them. At first I thought it was just the wind whistling through the rocks, but as we settled around the fire with our beers and trail mix, the sounds became more distinct. Voices, faint and distant, seeming to rise from the waves themselves. Not words exactly, but something that suggested communication, like overhearing a conversation in a language you almost recognize. "You guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Marcus tilted his head, listening. Sarah continued staring into the flames, her face blank in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Hear what?" Marcus finally said, but his tone suggested he did hear something he didn't want to acknowledge. The voices grew clearer as full darkness settled over the beach. They seemed to be calling, pleading, with a desperation that made my skin crawl. And they all seemed to be saying the same thing, over and over, a single word that sounded like warmth, or hearth, or maybe hurt. Sarah stood abruptly and walked toward the water's edge. I called after her, but she either didn't hear or chose to ignore me. In the firelight, I watched her bend down and begin collecting something from the sand. When she returned, her arms were full of shells. Dozens of them, each roughly the size of my palm and shaped like spirals. "These were calling," she said simply, her voice flat and distant. "Can't you feel them vibrating?" She held out her hands, and I could see the shells trembling slightly, as if something inside them was trying to get out. The sensation traveled up my arms when I touched one, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, accompanied by that same pleading voice, clearer now, almost intimate in its proximity to my ear. Marcus backed away from the shells as if they might bite him. "What the hell, Sarah? Those things are wrong." But Sarah was already moving toward the fire. one of the shells cradled in her palms like an offering. The voices from the water grew louder, more urgent, as she approached the flames. "They want warmth," she said, her voice dreamy and distant. "They've been cold for so long." Before either Marcus or I could stop her, she tossed the shell into the heart of the fire. The flames erupted upward, turning brilliant white for a moment before settling back into their normal orange glow. But something remained in the fire, a shape that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. It was transparent, like heat shimmer given form, but undeniably present. And it was moving. The figure that emerged from the flames was made of something that looked like seawater, given substance. Translucent, flowing, constantly shifting. But the shape it took was unmistakably human, unmistakably familiar. It was Sarah, or rather, a perfect liquid duplicate of her, down to the way she tilted her head when concentrating and the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. The water Sarah stepped out of the fire without being burned, her movements fluid and hypnotic. She looked exactly like the real Sarah, except for her eyes, which held depths that belonged to the ocean floor, and the way seaweed seemed to drift through her translucent form like hair in an underwater current. "Oh God," Marcus whispered, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of this impossible duplicate. This thing that wore Sarah's face but wasn't Sarah. It turned toward me with movements that were too smooth, too flowing. And I saw my own face reflected in those dark, oceanic eyes. The water Sarah began walking toward the real Sarah, who stood frozen by the fire's edge. And as the duplicate moved, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Sarah's shadow was following the water creature, stretching across the sand like a leash. Where the shadow touched the duplicate's feet, it seemed to adhere, to become part of the translucent form. "Sarah!" I shouted, finally finding my voice. "Get away from it!" But Sarah didn't respond. She was staring at her liquid double with an expression of recognition, as if she was seeing something in those oceanic eyes that I couldn't perceive. The water Sarah reached out a dripping hand, and the real Sarah began to follow as the duplicate turned toward the ocean. That's when I noticed my own shadow. It was wrong, too short, too faint, as if something was draining it of substance. And with growing horror, I realized that all our shadows had become strange, attenuated, as if they were being slowly pulled away from us. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "We have to stop her," he said, his voice high with panic. "Look at her shadow. It's being pulled into that thing." I lunged forward and grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back from the water duplicate. She turned to me with eyes that seemed momentarily unfocused, as if she'd been sleepwalking. The water Sarah continued toward the ocean, dragging Sarah's shadow behind it like a chain. "What's happening to me?" Sarah whispered, her voice small and confused. "I can see myself walking away, but I'm right here." The water duplicate reached the edge of the waves and began to dissolve, flowing back into the ocean with movements that were almost reluctant. But Sarah's shadow didn't return. Where her feet touched the sand, only the faintest outline remained, and I could see that ours were similarly diminished. "The shells," I said, understanding hitting me like a physical blow. "It's the shells. We have to get rid of them." But even as I said it, I could see more shells scattered across the beach, dozens of them, all vibrating with that same urgent energy. The voices from the water were louder now, more insistent, and I could make out individual words in what sounded like multiple languages, all pleading for the same thing: warmth, fire, release from the cold depths. Marcus was already moving, gathering the shells Sarah had collected and hurling them as far from the fire as he could. But with each shell that landed, the voices grew more desperate, more demanding, and I could see our shadows continuing to fade, becoming mere suggestions against the sand. "We can't just throw them away," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she fought off whatever trance had held her. "They'll just call to someone else. We have to do something permanent." I looked at the fire, then at the shells, then at our rapidly fading shadows. The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. Every shell thrown into the flames would create another duplicate, Another theft of shadow and identity. But leaving them scattered across the beach meant condemning whoever found them next to the same fate. Bury them, I said, the solution coming to me with sudden clarity. We bury them in patterns, like Sarah said, circles. It might contain whatever's inside them. We worked frantically as the tide began to turn, our shadows growing ever fainter as more duplicates seemed to form in the waves. Half-glimpsed figures that might have been reflections, or might have been something worse. The shells felt heavier as we buried them, as if they were fighting our efforts to contain them. The first circle was small, just a few shells buried in a tight ring around our fire. The voices quieted slightly, becoming less urgent but more sorrowful, like mourners at a funeral. The second circle was larger, encompassing most of the beach, and required us to work separately, each carrying armfuls of the vibrating shells to predetermined points. As I dug holes in the wet sand, my hands began to shake, not from cold or exertion, but from a growing certainty that we were being watched. Every time I glanced toward the water, I caught glimpses of movement, shapes that could have been waves or could have been something else entirely. The feeling of eyes on my back was so intense, it was almost physical, like fingers trailing across my neck. "Hurry!" Marcus called from across the beach, his voice thin with exhaustion and fear. The tide's coming in fast. The third and final circle was the largest, encompassing the entire visible beach. By the time we finished, the water was lapping at our ankles, and our shadows were so faint they were barely visible even in direct firelight. But the voices had stopped. The shells no longer vibrated in our hands, and the watching presence that had followed our every movement seemed to withdraw, pulling back into the depths like a retreating tide. We stood in the center of our concentric circles, breathing hard, our shadows mere whispers against the sand. The fire had burned low, casting everything in deep orange and black. In the distance, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, but now it sounded like ordinary waves again, without the undertone of desperate voices. "Did we do it?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from exertion. "Are we safe?" I looked at our shadows, so faint they were barely there, and wondered if we'd ever be whole again. The duplicates were gone, dissolved back into the sea, but they'd taken something essential with them. I felt hollowed out, as if part of my fundamental self had been carved away and would never return. "I think so," I said, though the words felt hollow. "But we should go, now." We packed our gear in silence, dousing the fire and scattering the ashes. The walk back up the cliff trail felt different, easier in some ways, as if we weighed less than before, but also wrong, like we were missing some essential component of ourselves. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot and I saw our reflections in the car windows that the full horror hit me. Our reflections were there, clear and normal, but when the headlights swept across the pavement behind us, they cast no shadows at all. 3 weeks later, I've convinced myself it was mass hysteria, some kind of shared psychological break brought on by isolation and the strangeness of that place. The rational part of my mind insists that shadows don't disappear, that water can't take human form, that shells don't plead for warmth in ancient voices. But when I pass mirrors, I find myself looking longer than I should, searching for something that might be missing. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the ocean calling from hundreds of miles away, whispering my name with the voice of someone who looks exactly like me but isn't me at all. The worst part isn't the fear that it was real. The worst part is the growing certainty that those circles we dug in the sand weren't meant to contain the shells at all. They were meant to mark us, to identify us as the ones who'd listened to the voices and answered their call. Because last night, I dreamed I was standing on that beach again, watching 3 figures emerge from the waves. They looked like us, moved like us, but their eyes held the depth of the ocean floor. And in the dream, I realized that we'd never left the beach at all. We were still there, shadows trapped in translucent forms, calling to others to bring us warmth. I woke up with salt water on my pillow and sand between my teeth, and for just a moment, I couldn't remember which version of myself was real. Story 7. And the grease from the diner's fryer had settled into my pores like motor oil, and the fluorescent buzz still echoed in my skull as I pushed through the back door into Detroit's 3 a.m. chill. My shift at Mel's 24-hour had stretched into its 14th hour, and the weight of stacked plates and endless coffee refills pressed against my shoulders like concrete blocks. The smart route home meant 12 blocks through well-lit streets, past the occasional patrol car and the safety of street lamps. But smart required energy I didn't possess. The alley behind Corktown's abandoned storefronts promised to cut my walk in half. I'd used it before during daylight, when broken glass sparkled like discarded diamonds and graffiti told stories in languages I almost understood. Now, standing at its mouth, the narrow passage yawned black as an open throat. My feet made the decision before my brain caught up. The first step into shadow felt like crossing a threshold I wasn't meant to cross. The alley stretched longer than memory suggested, flanked by brick walls that seemed to lean inward with each footfall. Decades of Detroit's decline had left their mark here. Boarded windows stared down like dead eyes, and fire escapes hung at impossible angles, their metal bones warped by time and neglect. The air tasted of rust and something else, something organic and ancient that made my sinuses burn. 20 steps in, the first street lamp flickered to life. I stopped, breath forming small clouds in the sudden circle of amber light. The fixture hadn't worked in months. I was certain of it. The bulb should have been shattered, the wiring long since stripped by scavengers. Yet here it glowed, casting my shadow long and distorted across the opposite wall. Except my shadow wasn't alone. Another shape clung to the brick beside it, darker than the darkness around it, as if someone had taken a paintbrush dipped in pure night and drawn a human silhouette with deliberate, careful strokes. The figure stood perfectly still, but its stillness felt active, watchful. It had no dimension, no depth. A paper cutout pressed against the wall, yet somehow more substantial than the bricks that contained it. I took a step sideways. My shadow moved with me. The other remained fixed in place. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant, and my breath began coming in rapid puffs. I could feel my pulse in my temples, in my wrists, everywhere my blood tried to push through increasingly narrow passages. The rational part of my mind, the part that had carried me through 16 years of night shifts and unpaid bills, offered explanations. Trick of the light, graffiti, exhaustion playing games with perception. But that same exhaustion had sharpened something else, some primitive awareness that recognized threat in the tilt of shadows and the quality of silence. This wasn't fatigue. This was presence. "You're cutting through my domain." The words didn't come from anywhere specific. They seemed to rise from the bricks themselves, from the mortar between them, from the accumulated weight of decades pressing down on this forgotten space. Not a voice exactly, but an articulation of intention that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the fear center of my brain. My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but only managed a sound like static clearing from an old radio. The shadow peeled itself from the wall. It happened in slow motion and all at once, the way dreams move. Impossible physics that felt absolutely natural while occurring. The silhouette maintained its two-dimensional appearance but began expanding, growing taller and wider, stretching toward the narrow strip of space I occupied. As it moved, I could see the brick wall behind it, as if it were made of colored glass rather than solid darkness. "You take shortcuts through places that aren't yours," it continued. And now I could feel the words vibrating through the soles of my shoes, through the pavement, up through my bones. "Every step you take here steals a piece of what I am. So I'll take what you are in return." The shadow reached toward me, and where it touched the air, space seemed to compress. The walls of the alley drew closer, or maybe I was shrinking, or maybe the shadow was somehow folding reality to fit its needs. I could feel myself becoming flatter, thinner, as if invisible hands were pressing me between the pages of an enormous book. Panic flooded my system with chemicals that made my vision sharper and my thoughts clearer. I remembered something my grandfather had told me about Detroit, about the old neighborhoods that used to exist before urban renewal bulldozed them into memory. He'd grown up here, knew the streets that no longer had names, the places that persisted in old men's minds long after the city had erased them from maps. Fairfield Court, I said, the words tumbling out before I fully understood why. Hastings Street, Paradise Valley. The compression stopped. The shadow paused, its dark mass hovering inches from my face. This close, I could see that it wasn't smooth. It was made of texture, of layers, like sediment compressed over geological time. Soot and ash, the residue of fires and exhaust, the accumulated darkness of a city that had burned and rebuilt and burned again. You know the buried names, it said, and something like surprise colored the non-voice. Harmony Row, I continued, memory and desperation working together. Black Bottom, St. Aubin, Mullet Street. With each name, the shadow drew back slightly, retreating toward the wall like a tide pulling away from shore, but I could feel its attention sharpening, its interest growing darker and more complex. Those streets don't exist anymore, it whispered. They exist here, I said, gesturing at the space around us. In places like this, in the shadows between what was and what is. The second street lamp flickered on, then the third, creating overlapping pools of amber light that left narrow corridors of darkness between them. The shadow flowed into these spaces like liquid, maintaining its form but becoming fragmented, divided among the gaps. If you know the names, it said, then you know the rules. You can pass through my domain, but only where the light cannot reach. Only in the spaces I still own. Looking ahead, I could see the pattern now. A path through shadow that would require careful navigation, precise steps that avoided the illuminated areas while traversing the dark channels between. It was possible, but barely. And if I step in the light, then you become part of the wall. Part of me. Another shadow among shadows, pressed flat and thin until even your screams are two-dimensional. I looked at the path again, measuring distances with my eyes. The dark strips were narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I'd have to move slowly, deliberately, keeping my entire body within the boundaries of shadow. Why the names? I asked, needing to understand before I committed to this impossible journey. Because names are the only things that survive erasure, the shadow replied. When they tore down the neighborhoods, when they scattered the families, when they buried the history under highways and parking lots, the names remained, spoken in kitchens, written in letters, remembered in prayers. They're all I have left of what this place used to be. The shadow fragmented further as more lights flickered on, creating an intricate maze of illumination and darkness. I could see the end of the alley now, a rectangle of lesser blackness that promised escape. Start walking, it said. But remember, every step you take here, you take with the permission of the dead. I placed my right foot into the first corridor of shadow, feeling the temperature drop around my ankle as if I'd stepped into cold water. The shadow seemed to welcome me, flowing around my foot like thick liquid. My body wanted to rush, to run, to break free of this impossible situation through speed and momentum. But I forced myself to move slowly, carefully, keeping my entire body within the narrow channel of darkness. Elmwood Park, I said, dredging up more names from family stories and half-remembered conversations. Garfield Street, Willis Avenue. The shadow purred approval, a sound like wind through broken windows. I took another step, then another, navigating the zigzag path between pools of light. My peripheral vision caught movement in the illuminated areas, shapes that might have been other shadows, other travelers who had failed this test, pressed flat against brick and mortar for eternity. Halfway through the alley, my foot brushed the edge of a light pool. The sensation was immediate and horrifying. A pulling, a flattening, as if the solid ground beneath my feet had become a vice attempting to compress me into two dimensions. I jerked back into shadow, gasping, feeling my body slowly return to its proper thickness. Careful, the shadow warned, and I heard something like amusement in its non-voice. The light doesn't forgive. I continued forward, more cautious now, calling out street names like a mantra. Rio Pell Street, Russell Street, Brush Park, Adelaide. With each name, I felt the shadow's approval, its grudging respect for my knowledge of Detroit's buried geography. But I also felt its hunger, its desire to claim me regardless of our bargain. This was a creature of appetite, of accumulation, and I was walking through its stomach. The final stretch required a sideways shuffle along a particularly narrow strip of darkness. My back pressed against cold brick while light from the last street lamp painted everything in front of me in shades of amber and gold. The shadow flowed beside me, around me, its presence both protective and threatening. Almost, it whispered. Just a few more steps. But as I neared the end of the alley, something changed. The quality of darkness ahead looked different, not empty, but full, pregnant with possibility. And I realized with growing horror that the rectangle of escape I'd been moving toward wasn't an exit at all. It was another shadow, larger and hungrier than the one that had been my reluctant guide. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" the original shadow asked. And now its amusement was unmistakable. "You've learned the names, proven your knowledge, earned your passage. But passage through my domain only leads to larger domains, hungrier shadows, older hungers." The massive shadow at the alley's end began to move, unfolding itself from the walls like a living origami creation. It had no fixed form. Sometimes it looked human, sometimes like a building, sometimes like the negative space left behind when something enormous had been torn away. "This is the downtown shadow," my guide explained. "It feeds on the dreams of the displaced, the hopes of the demolished. It's been waiting here since they tore down Corktown the first time, and it's been growing ever since." I stood frozen between the two entities, paralyzed by the impossibility of my situation. Behind me, the smaller shadow waited with predatory patience. Ahead, something vast and ancient stirred with the slow hunger of geological time. "There's another way," the smaller shadow said softly. "Another path. But it requires a different kind of payment." "What?" "Give me one of your memories of this place. Something real, something meaningful. A moment when Detroit was more than ruins to you. When it was home instead of just a place you worked." I closed my eyes, thinking of my grandfather's stories, of summer evenings on his porch when the city still felt like it had a future. The memory of his voice, rough with cigarettes and fondness, telling me about the old neighborhood, about neighbors who looked out for each other, about streets lined with trees and hope. "Yes," the shadow breathed. "That one." I felt something pull away from me, a small but vital piece of who I was. The memory didn't disappear entirely, but it became flatter, less dimensional, like a photograph instead of a living experience. In return, a new path opened, not forward or backward, but sideways, through what should have been solid brick, but now gaped like an open doorway. Beyond it, I could see the street I'd been trying to reach, bathed in the orange glow of sodium lights, and beautifully, wonderfully mundane. I stumbled through the impossible opening, my legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. Behind me, I heard the shadow speak one last time. "Remember the names," it said. "Remember that some things survive even when everything else is torn down." I ran then, abandoning dignity and caution, sprinting through empty streets until I reached my apartment building. Only when I was inside, with 3 locks between me and the night, did I allow myself to examine what had happened. Had I really negotiated with a supernatural entity? Or had exhaustion and stress finally pushed me into a complete break from reality? The memory felt real, more real than most of my waking life. But memory was notoriously unreliable, especially under extreme conditions. I checked my clothes for evidence. No unusual dirt, no damage from brushing against brick walls. My shoes showed no sign of the careful sideways shuffling I remembered. Even the smell of the alley, rust and decay and something organic, had completely disappeared. But when I tried to remember my grandfather's voice telling those stories about old Detroit, I found only fragments, like trying to recall a dream after waking. The memory was there, but diminished, compressed, as if something had indeed been taken from it. I made coffee and sat by my kitchen window as dawn painted the city in shades of gray and gold. Somewhere out there, between the abandoned buildings and the construction cranes, Detroit continued its slow transformation, tearing down, building up, forgetting and remembering in cycles that stretched back generations. And in the spaces between what was and what would be, in the shadows that persisted despite urban renewal and gentrification, and all the other forces that reshaped cities, something waited. Something that knew the names of vanished streets and fed on the dreams of the displaced. Whether that something was real or a creation of my own exhausted mind, I couldn't say. But I knew I would never take that alley again. Some shortcuts I had learned were too expensive to repeat. The sun rose higher, burning away the shadows and replacing mystery with mundane clarity. But even in full daylight, I could feel them there. The dark spaces between buildings, the forgotten corners where old names lingered like prayers. And sometimes, when the light hit the walls just right, I thought I could see shapes pressed into the brick, thin and flat and patient, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to think they could take shortcuts through domains that didn't belong to them. Story 8. Thermometer outside my kitchen window read -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and falling. Steam rose from my coffee mug like tiny ghosts fleeing the warmth, dissipating into the yellow light of the single bulb hanging above my kitchen table. Outside, Minnesota's February wind howled against the house, with the persistence of something trying to get in. My dog, Chester, lay sprawled across the worn hardwood floor, his gray muzzle twitching occasionally as he dreamed. At 14, he spent most of his time sleeping now, his arthritic joints grateful for any warmth the old furnace could provide. The house creaked and settled around us, a symphony of aging wood and shifting metal that I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years of living here alone. But tonight, something felt different. The coffee had gone cold in my hands when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the usual repertoire of house noises. It came from below, from the basement I rarely ventured into except to check the furnace or flip a circuit breaker. A wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across concrete. Chester's ears pricked up, his eyes opening to fix on the basement door with an alertness I hadn't seen in months. The sound came again, more distinct this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but with an odd quality that made my skin crawl. They seemed to stick and release with each movement, as if the walker was trudging through something thick and viscous. I set down my mug and moved toward the basement door, Chester rising to follow with unusual urgency. His breathing had become rapid, almost panting, though the house wasn't particularly warm. When I placed my hand on the doorknob, the metal was so cold it nearly stuck to my palm. The basement stairs descended into darkness thick enough to feel solid. I flicked on the light switch, and the bare bulb at the bottom illuminated a concrete floor that shouldn't have been wet but was. Water, or something that looked like water, covered the basement floor in patches, reflecting the weak light in ways that hurt to look at directly. But it wasn't the wetness that made me freeze on the top step. It was the footprints. They led from the far corner of the basement, where the original foundation met the newer addition, and climbed the concrete steps in perfect, deliberate sequence. But these weren't ordinary footprints. They appeared to be pressed into ice, clear, crystalline impressions that caught and refracted the light into prismatic fragments. Each print was perfectly preserved, as if frozen the moment it was made. Chester whimpered behind me, a sound I'd never heard him make. His body pressed against my legs, trembling not from cold but from something deeper, an instinctual fear that predated thousands of years of domestication. I descended 3 steps before the cold hit me like a physical force. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the metal handrail beneath my grip. The temperature differential was impossible. The upstairs had been comfortable, but down here felt like stepping into a meat locker. The footprints led directly to the stairs, then up, past where I stood, up into my house. I backed up quickly, Chester scrambling behind me and slammed the basement door. My hands shook as I turned the deadbolt. When had I installed a deadbolt on an interior door? I couldn't remember, but I was grateful for it now. Back in the kitchen, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Old houses settle, pipes leak, water freezes in cold temperatures. But even as I listed these explanations, I knew they fell short. Water doesn't freeze in perfectly shaped footprints, and it certainly doesn't climb stairs. Chester had positioned himself in the center of the kitchen, his body rigid with attention focused on the basement door. Every few minutes, he would let out a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Not the territorial bark of a dog defending his home, but something more primal. A warning. That's when I remembered what the previous owner had told me during the walkthrough, details I'd dismissed as the eccentricities of an old man eager to sell. The house had been built in 1987 on the site of an artificial lake created by a local developer in the 1950s. The lake had been drained in the early 1980s when the development plans changed, but old-timers in the area still called it Lake Holloway. The old man had mentioned something else, something I'd half listened to while examining the foundation for cracks. He'd said the lake never properly dried, that water still seeped up through the ground during particularly cold winters. He'd also mentioned that several houses built on the old lake bed had peculiar heating bills, astronomical costs that couldn't be explained by the age of the homes or the efficiency of their systems. It's like the ground underneath draws the heat right out, he'd said, his watery eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, she moved out after 3 winters, said the cold followed her around the house. I'd dismissed it as the rambling of an old man, but now, with Chester trembling beside me and frost forming on the inside of my windows despite the furnace running constantly, those words carried new weight. The clock on the microwave read 11:47 p.m. According to the weather app on my phone, the temperature outside wouldn't start rising until around 6 a.m., when it was expected to climb to minus 16 degrees. 2 degrees. I needed to wait 6 more hours for a 2-degree increase. Chester had begun to pace now, his movements becoming increasingly agitated. Every few minutes he would stop and stare at the basement door, his hackles raised. Then he would look at me with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency, as if he was trying to communicate something vital. The house grew colder. I checked the thermostat. It was set to 72 degrees, but the display read 68 and falling. The furnace was running constantly now, its motor humming with a strain that suggested it was fighting a losing battle against something drawing heat away faster than it could be produced. Chester's pacing became more frantic. His breathing had grown labored, and when I knelt to check on him, his fur was damp with something that wasn't quite sweat but wasn't entirely moisture from the cooling air either. His eyes, usually bright despite his age, had begun to grow heavy. That's when I understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. Chester was falling asleep. The realization brought with it a flood of understanding that I couldn't fully explain but couldn't deny. The footprints in the basement, the impossible cold, the way the temperature seemed to be draining from the house despite the furnace's desperate efforts. Something was down there, something that fed on warmth and would grow stronger as Chester grew weaker. I had to keep him awake. I started with the obvious, calling his name, petting him, trying to get him to sit and stay alert. But his responses grew increasingly sluggish. His eyelids drooped, and his body swayed slightly as if he was fighting unconsciousness. Then I remembered his favorite game from his younger days, hide and seek with his tennis ball. I found the worn yellow sphere behind the couch and squeaked it once. Chester's ears perked up immediately, and for a moment, his eyes cleared. I threw the ball across the kitchen, and Chester trotted after it, his movements still slow but purposeful. When he brought it back, I could see that the effort had wakened him slightly. His breathing was less labored, and some of the alertness had returned to his eyes. For the next hour, I kept the game going. Throw the ball, Chester retrieves it, brief moment of activity that pushes back against the encroaching lethargy. But I could feel something else happening as we played. The cold in the house was responding to Chester's movements, ebbing and flowing like a tide tied to his energy levels. When Chester was active, chasing the ball or standing alert, the temperature would stabilize. The frost on the windows would stop spreading. The furnace would catch up slightly, but the moment he showed signs of fatigue, the cold would press in again, more insistent than before. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. They were no longer confined to the basement. Now they moved through the walls themselves, a wet dragging sound that traveled from room to room on the ground floor. I could track their progress by the way the temperature dropped in each area they passed through. The living room, the hallway, the dining room. They were circling us. Chester heard them too. His body remained tense despite his exhaustion, his head turning to follow sounds I could barely detect. Occasionally he would whimper and look up at me with those increasingly heavy eyes, as if apologizing for not being able to stay awake. I tried everything I could think of. Food. Chester loved treats, but he could barely lift his head to sniff them. Water. He drank a little, but even that seemed to require enormous effort. I even tried playing his favorite music, old country songs he used to howl along with, but his response was minimal. The ball game was the only thing that worked, and even that was becoming less effective as the hours passed. Chester's retrieves grew slower, his returns to me less enthusiastic. Sometimes he would stand over the ball for long moments, swaying slightly, before remembering what he was supposed to do. Around 4 a.m., the footsteps reached the kitchen. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence moving around the edges of the room. The temperature plummeted so quickly that my breath became thick clouds, and frost began forming on Chester's fur. He was lying down now, unable to summon the energy to chase the ball, his breathing shallow and rapid. The presence circled us, and with each pass, Chester grew weaker. His eyes were nearly closed, his body shivering uncontrollably. I knelt beside him, trying to share what warmth I had, but I could feel it being drawn away from both of us. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The ice footprints weren't just in the basement anymore. They were forming on my kitchen floor, one step at a time, in a slow circle around where Chester lay. The circle was tightening. In desperation, I grabbed Chester's favorite rope toy and began playing tug-of-war with him, trying to engage whatever fighting spirit he had left. For a few precious minutes it worked. He pulled back weakly, his tail managing a few feeble wags, and the temperature stabilized slightly. But I could see that we were losing the battle. Chester's efforts grew weaker with each passing minute, and the cold pressed in more aggressively. The ice footprints were now only 3 feet away from where we huddled together on the kitchen floor. I checked my phone. 5:23 a.m. 37 minutes until sunrise. 37 minutes until the temperature outside would climb those crucial 2 degrees. Chester's eyes closed. The moment his lids shut, the cold exploded inward like a dam bursting. Frost covered every surface in the kitchen instantly. My coffee mug cracked from the rapid temperature change. The metal chair legs began to creak and groan as they contracted, and the ice footprints moved forward. I shook Chester frantically, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His breathing had become so shallow I could barely detect it. The warmth was leaving his body rapidly, and with it, mine. In desperation, I scooped him up in my arms, my movements clumsy with cold, and carried him to the living room, where the fireplace offered the last hope of warmth. I had no firewood, but I began feeding the flames with whatever I could find. Magazines, wooden kitchen utensils, even a chair I dragged in from the dining room. The fire caught eagerly, as if it too was fighting against the unnatural cold. Chester stirred slightly in my arms, and I felt a moment of hope. But the ice footprints followed us into the living room. They formed in a wide circle around the fireplace, and I could feel the presence studying us, waiting. The fire burned higher, fed by my desperate fuel feeding, but even its heat seemed insufficient against the cold that pressed in from all sides. Chester's breathing stopped. For one terrible moment, the house fell completely silent. The furnace ceased its struggling hum. The wind outside died to nothing. Even the fire seemed to pause in its crackling. Then slowly, Chester's eyes opened, but something was wrong. His eyes were completely white, as if covered with a thin film of ice. And when he looked at me, I saw no recognition there, only a vast, cold intelligence that had nothing to do with my faithful companion. The thing wearing Chester's form spoke, its voice like wind through frozen branches. The warmth is sufficient. The debt is paid. The ice footprints began to retreat, melting away as they moved backward toward the kitchen, toward the basement, toward whatever depths they had emerged from. The temperature in the house began to rise rapidly, my frozen fingers burning as feeling returned to them. Chester blinked, and his eyes cleared. He looked up at me with confusion, as if waking from a deep sleep, then licked my face with his usual affection. His body felt warm again, vibrantly alive. By 6 a.m., the thermometer outside read -16 degrees, exactly 2 degrees warmer than it had been when this all began. I checked the basement, finding only dry concrete and a functioning furnace. The ice footprints were gone. The wet patches had vanished. Chester spent the rest of the morning sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, occasionally twitching with normal dog dreams. I've spent the hours since sunrise trying to convince myself that what happened was real. The evidence supports both possibilities. I could have fallen asleep and dreamed the entire encounter, my subconscious mind weaving together the old man's stories about the lake, my anxiety about Chester's age, and the extreme cold into a vivid nightmare. But Chester hasn't been the same since that night. He's more alert, more energetic than he's been in months. His arthritis seems to have vanished. He plays fetch with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. And sometimes, in the early morning hours when the house is quiet, I catch him staring at the basement door with an expression I can't quite read. His eyes are bright and warm and completely normal. Almost completely normal. Because sometimes, just for a moment when the light hits them just right, I swear they reflect things that aren't there. Footprints made of ice. Empty rooms filled with presents. A vast lake that was never really drained, only sleeping beneath the foundation of my house. Chester is fine. Better than fine. The cold hasn't returned. But I find myself checking the weather obsessively, watching for those nights when the temperature might drop just low enough for something old and patient to start climbing stairs made of ice, looking for warmth to sustain it through another season of waiting. And I've started keeping Chester's tennis ball in my pocket, just in case we need to play another game of fetch, just in case the breathing winter returns, and we need to prove once again that some warmth is worth preserving, no matter the cost. Story 9. And the first arrow appeared on our third morning in the Adirondacks, carved into the earth with surgical precision. Coarse salt crystals caught the pre-dawn light like scattered teeth, forming a perfect line that pointed directly at our cabin door. Sarah was still asleep when I discovered it, her breathing steady beneath the quilted covers we'd pulled from the rental's musty closet. The arrow stretched maybe 4 feet long, its point sharp enough to pierce flesh if the salt had been steel instead of mineral. I should have photographed it, should have called Sarah outside to witness this strange, welcoming gift. Instead, I found myself reaching for the push broom we'd left leaning against the porch rail, its bristles already damp with mountain dew. The moment I swept the first cluster of salt crystals, the air around me shuddered like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The sensation crawled up my arms and settled behind my sternum, a pressure that made my teeth ache. The cabin groaned. Not the settling sounds old wood makes when temperature shifts, but a deliberate displacement, as though invisible hands had gripped the structure and shifted it several inches to the left. Sarah's coffee mug rattled against the kitchen windowsill. The floorboards beneath my feet tilted just enough to notice, just enough to question. By the time I'd swept the entire arrow into scattered fragments, my hands were trembling. The morning felt different now, thinner somehow, as though the boundary between our rented sanctuary and something else had worn gossamer fine. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes, asking about the scraping sounds that had woken her. I told her I'd been cleaning pine needles from the porch. The lie came so easily I almost believed it myself. The second arrow appeared the following morning, slightly larger, its salt gleaming with an oily sheen that caught my attention even before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. This time I hesitated before sweeping. The previous day had passed normally enough. We'd hiked the lower trails, shared a bottle of wine on the porch, made love while rain drummed against the windows. But something had felt off kilter, like walking through a house where all the pictures hung slightly crooked. When I finally swept this second arrow, the displacement was more pronounced. The entire cabin lurched, and I heard Sarah cry out from inside as books tumbled from their shelf. Through the window, I watched her steady herself against the kitchen counter, confusion creasing her features. She asked if I'd felt the tremor, mentioned something about earthquake activity in the region. I nodded, though no seismic event could explain the precise geometry of salt arrows, or the way shadows seemed to fall at impossible angles in the aftermath. That afternoon, while Sarah napped, I drove to the general store in the valley. The elderly clerk, a man whose weathered face suggested decades of mountain winters, regarded me with eyes the color of pine bark. When I asked about local folklore, about anything unusual visitors might encounter, his expression shuddered. "You staying up at the old Henderson place?" he asked. I confirmed we were renting the cabin. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a slim volume bound in cracked leather. The cover read, "Adirondack Mysteries and Mountain Spirits," and the pages felt soft as skin between my fingers. He refused payment, simply nodded toward the book, and mentioned that some knowledge carried its own price. The almanac's prose was dense with 19th century formality, but the entry about the mountain jailer made my coffee grow cold in my hands. According to the text, this entity had been trapping travelers since the earliest settlements, confining them to spaces that existed parallel to, but separate from normal geography. The key detail, the one that made my vision blur with recognition, was the spirit's method. It marked its chosen victims with arrows of mineral salt, and any attempt to return that salt to the earth completed a binding ritual. The only escape was to dissolve each arrow in running water before sunrise could illuminate the next marking. I drove back to the cabin with my foot heavy on the accelerator, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. Sarah was awake when I arrived, standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself despite the afternoon warmth. She asked where I'd been, and when I told her, she frowned. "I didn't see you leave," she said. "I've been awake for hours." The third arrow was waiting the next morning, and this time Sarah saw it before I did. She stood in the doorway, pointing at the salt formation with something approaching wonder. The crystals seemed to pulse in the early light, and I noticed they'd arranged themselves in a pattern more complex than simple geometry. Spirals within spirals, each curve precise as calligraphy. "Did you make this?" she asked. The question hit me like cold water. I stared at her, searching for signs of jest or accusation, but found only genuine curiosity. When I denied any involvement, she tilted her head in that particular way that meant she was processing information that didn't quite fit her understanding of the world. "It's beautiful," she said, "like a mandala." I swept it immediately, ignoring her protests. The displacement this time sent ripples through the air itself, and I watched Sarah stumble as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her expression cycled through confusion, concern, and something else, something that looked almost like suspicion. The pattern continued. Each morning brought a more elaborate salt arrow, each more intricate than the last. Some incorporated symbols I didn't recognize, angular marks that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Others formed geometric patterns so complex they hurt to contemplate, as though my mind couldn't quite process their true shape. Sarah began commenting on my behavior. She mentioned how early I'd been rising, how I seemed distracted during our conversations. When she asked about my reading material, I showed her random pages from the almanac, sections about wildflowers and geological formations. The entry about the mountain jailer remained hidden beneath my thumb whenever she looked. By the second week, the cabin's daily displacement had become significant enough that Sarah couldn't ignore it. Furniture slid across floors. Picture frames hung askew. The bathroom door no longer aligned properly with its frame. She mentioned calling the rental company, suggested there might be foundation issues or subsidence problems. I discouraged this, claiming the phenomena were perfectly normal for older mountain structures. The lie tasted bitter, but the alternative, explaining salt arrows and spirit folklore, seemed exponentially worse. How could I tell her that each morning I dissolved mineral formations in the creek behind our cabin, racing against sunrise while she slept? How could I describe the way the water hissed when salt crystals touched its surface, or the shadows that seemed to retreat from the sound? The arrows were becoming increasingly elaborate. Some mornings I found multiple formations, scattered around the cabin's perimeter like a siege of symbols. The salt itself had changed, taking on colors that didn't occur naturally. Deep purples and electric blues that made my eyes water. When I swept these into my bucket for transport to the creek, they generated heat that warmed the metal handle through my gloves. Sarah's sleep became restless. She talked in her dreams, fragments of conversation I couldn't quite decipher. Sometimes I heard my own name mixed with words in languages I didn't recognize. When I asked about her dreams the next morning, she claimed to remember nothing beyond vague impressions of being watched. The watching sensation had infected me as well. During our daily hikes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, certain that something tracked our movement through the trees. The forest felt different now, too quiet, with shadows that pooled in impossible configurations. Even Sarah noticed the changed atmosphere, mentioning how the usual sounds of wildlife had diminished. 3 weeks into our rental period, I made a mistake. Exhausted from another sleepless night spent monitoring the cabin's perimeter, I overslept and discovered the salt arrow just as sunrise painted the mountain peaks. The formation was massive, a complex mandala of white crystals that covered nearly the entire clearing in front of our door. Sarah stood beside me in her pajamas, coffee mug forgotten in her hands. "This is impossible," she whispered. I ran for my supplies, but it was too late. As the first direct sunlight touched the salt crystals, they began to glow with their own internal luminescence. The air around us thickened like honey, and when I tried to step forward with my broom, my movements felt sluggish and disconnected from my intentions. The cabin lurched violently, and this time the displacement didn't stop. The entire structure began rotating slowly on its foundation, floorboards creaking in harmony as familiar landmarks shifted outside our windows. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh through my jacket. "What's happening?" she demanded. I had no answer that wouldn't sound like madness. The creek where I'd been dissolving the salt arrows was no longer visible through the trees. The path we'd used to reach the main road had vanished entirely, replaced by forest that looked simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. Even the morning light felt different, thicker, more golden, as though filtered through centuries of accumulated atmosphere. Sarah released my arm and walked to the window. Her reflection looked strange in the glass, slightly blurred as though seen through water. When she turned back to face me, her expression had changed. "You've been lying to me," she said. The statement hung between us like a blade. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't form. How long had she known? How much had she seen? The questions multiplied in my mind while she continued staring at me with eyes that seemed older than I remembered. "Every morning," she continued, "I've watched you from the bedroom window. I've seen you talking to empty air while you work. I've heard you whispering names I don't recognize." My throat felt lined with sand. The bucket and broom hung limp in my hands while something fundamental shifted in the space between us. Had I been talking to myself? Had the isolation and repetitive ritual driven me deeper into delusion than I'd realized? "Sarah," I began, but she held up one hand to silence me. "The real question," she said, "is whether you've been creating these salt patterns yourself, or whether something else has been using your hands while you sleep." The possibility hit me like vertigo. I thought about the early mornings, the automatic movements of sweeping and carrying, the way my hands sometimes felt foreign when I woke. Had I been sleepwalking? Creating elaborate formations in the dirt while my conscious mind crafted explanations involving mountain spirits and folklore? Sarah stepped closer, and I noticed her bare feet left no impressions in the salt crystals scattered across our floor. The observation struck me as significant, though I couldn't articulate why. Everything about her seemed slightly incorporeal now, her voice too clear, her movements too fluid, her gaze too knowing. "The almanac you've been reading," she said. "Show me the entry about the mountain jailer." My hands moved without conscious direction, opening the leather-bound volume to the relevant page. But the text that appeared wasn't what I remembered. Instead of warnings about mineral arrows and binding rituals, the page contained only a single sentence, repeated in various fonts and sizes. The trapped cannot distinguish between salvation and imprisonment. I looked up to find Sarah smiling, though her expression contained no warmth. "The spirit doesn't trap people in the mountains," she said softly. "It traps them in their own minds, and the only way to escape is to stop believing in the trap." The cabin had stopped rotating, but the world outside remained fundamentally altered. Through the windows, I could see other cabins scattered across impossible landscapes, some floating in air, others buried to their roofs in earth that shouldn't exist. Each structure contained its own prisoner, and I understood with crystalline clarity that some had been repeating their rituals for decades. Sarah, or the thing wearing her appearance, reached for the door handle. "The choice is yours," she said. "Continue dissolving salt arrows that may or may not exist, or step outside and discover what's real." I stared at the bucket in my hands, then at the salt crystals still gleaming on the floor. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear running water that might have been the creek where I'd performed my daily ritual of dissolution. Or it might have been the sound of my own mind finally cracking under the weight of isolation and paranoia. Sarah opened the door, and beyond the threshold lay not the familiar forest of the Adirondacks, but a space filled with shifting possibilities, some terrifying, others beautiful, all equally uncertain. The salt arrow beneath my feet continued to glow, waiting for me to decide whether to sweep it away or follow it deeper into whatever maze I'd constructed around myself. In the end, perhaps the choice itself was the only real thing left. I took a step forward, though I could no longer be certain in which direction I was moving. Story 10. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar death rattle above me as I settled into another midnight shift at Morrison's Gas and Go. Interstate 5 stretched beyond the windows like a black river, occasionally disturbed by the sweep of headlights that never seemed to slow down for our little island of artificial daylight. The old analog clock on the wall behind the counter ticked with mechanical precision, its brass hands pointing to 11:47 p.m. when I unlocked the front door and flipped the neon sign from "Sorry, we're closed" to "Open 24 hours." 23 years I'd been working nights at this place, ever since Morrison Sr. hired me fresh out of high school. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me away from the complications of daylight living. Most nights passed in peaceful monotony, truckers buying coffee and energy drinks, insomniacs grabbing cigarettes and lottery tickets, the occasional drunk needing directions back to civilization. But tonight felt different from the moment I walked through that door. The air tasted metallic, like the moments before a thunderstorm, though the weather forecast had promised clear skies. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be, and the familiar sounds of the building, the hum of refrigerators, the whisper of the HVAC system, the distant rumble of traffic, felt muffled, as if someone had wrapped the entire station in cotton. I tried to shake off the unease by diving into my usual routine. Stock check, register count, coffee pot cleaning. The motions were so automatic that my hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar dance of preparing for another long night. But even these simple tasks felt wrong somehow. The coffee grounds spilled in patterns that looked almost deliberate, forming shapes that reminded me of newspaper headlines. The cash register drawer stuck when I tried to close it, and when I finally forced it shut, the slam echoed louder than it should have in the small space. At exactly midnight, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. I felt it instantly, goosebumps rising along my arms despite the thick flannel shirt I wore. My breath began forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and the coffee pot behind me started making that peculiar gurgling sound it made when the heating element fought against the cold. I glanced at the thermostat, still set to 72 degrees, but the digital display flickered between numbers as if it couldn't decide what temperature it was actually reading. The first car pulled up to pump 3 at 12:15 a.m. Nothing unusual about it. A beat-up sedan with one headlight dimmer than the other. But when I looked directly at it, the edges seemed to blur, like looking at something through water. The driver never came inside, never even got out of the car. The vehicle just sat there, engine running, while the meter on the pump remained stubbornly at 0. By 12:30, 3 more cars had arrived, all exhibiting the same behavior. They parked at different pumps, engines idling, but no one emerged. No gas was dispensed. They simply waited, and I found myself watching them through the windows with growing unease. Something about their positioning reminded me of a formation, like soldiers preparing for an assault. The analog clock's ticking grew louder. I tried to focus on inventory, pulling out the leather-bound ledger Morrison Sr. had insisted on maintaining, alongside the computerized system. His handwriting filled the pages, neat, precise entries dating back decades. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I noticed something odd. Every entry for October 15th, 1958, had been violently crossed out in red ink. The deletions were so aggressive that they'd torn through the paper in several places, leaving small wounds in the ledger's flesh. At 12:40, I found myself staring at the clock without remembering when I'd started watching it. The minute hand moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if someone kept nudging it forward and backward. 2 minutes to go before what? The thought had arrived unbidden, carrying with it a sense of dread so profound that my knees nearly buckled. 12:41. The cars outside began honking their horns in perfect unison, 3 long blasts that seemed to shake the windows despite the vehicle's distance from the building. The sound penetrated my bones, a frequency that resonated with something primal and terrified in my chest. I backed away from the windows, suddenly certain that looking directly at the cars would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. 12:42. They entered without opening the door. 3 figures materialized beyond the threshold, and my first coherent thought was that they weren't entirely there. They moved like shadows cast by a flickering candle, substantial enough to block the light, but fragile enough that I felt a strong wind might scatter them across the floor. As they approached the counter, their features became clearer, and I realized with mounting horror that they weren't people at all. They were newspaper clippings, headlines and photographs cut from yellowed newsprint, somehow arranged in human silhouettes, and animated by an intelligence that had no business existing. The figure in front bore the headline, "Triple Robbery Shocks Interstate Community," across what should have been its chest. The others carried fragments of related stories, witness testimonies, police reports, editorial condemnations of rising crime rates. Their movements were wrong, too fluid and too rigid simultaneously, like marionettes operated by someone who had never seen humans walk. They approached the counter with purpose, and when the lead figure raised what passed for an arm, I could read the smaller text beneath the main headline. 3 armed men strike Morrison's gas station. Owner hospitalized. The date was October 15th, 1958. My mouth went dry as desert sand. Morrison Sr. had never mentioned a robbery, never hinted at any traumatic incident in the station's past. But here was proof, animated and impossible, that something terrible had happened in this very building 67 years ago. The newspaper figures reached the counter, and the lead one began gesturing toward the cash register. No words emerged from its flat printed features, but its intention was unmistakable. It wanted me to open the drawer, to complete whatever transaction had been interrupted all those decades ago. I found myself moving toward the register despite every instinct screaming at me to run. My fingers hovered over the keys, and I noticed that my hands were shaking so violently that I could barely aim for the correct buttons. The newspaper robbers waited with inhuman patience, their forms shifting and rustling like leaves in a breeze I couldn't feel. I pressed the no sale button. The register drawer sprang open with its familiar electronic chime, but the sound stretched impossibly long, becoming a wail that seemed to originate from the building's foundation rather than the small speaker in the machine. The cash inside, $20 bills, 10s, 5s, and 1s, began fluttering as if caught in a windstorm, though the air around me remained perfectly still, and then the clock reset. The brass hands snapped backward with audible clicks, spinning counterclockwise until they reached 12:41. The newspaper figures froze mid-gesture, as motionless as actual headlines pinned to a bulletin board. For a moment, silence returned to the station, broken only by the renewed ticking of the clock. But something else had changed. A minute of my memory had simply vanished. I found myself standing at the counter with no clear recollection of how I'd gotten there. The register drawer was closed, though I could have sworn it had been open moments before. The newspaper figures were gone, but the cars outside remained in their ominous formation, engines still running, headlights still cutting through the darkness. The clock read 12:41. Again, the realization hit me like cold water. This had happened before. Not just tonight, but many times. How many times? How many minutes had I lost to this impossible cycle? The knowledge felt like trying to grasp smoke. The harder I concentrated, the more it slipped away. 12:42. They returned. This time I tried to resist their approach, backing away from the counter and shouting at them to leave. My voice echoed strangely in the confined space, taking on harmonics that didn't belong to human vocal cords. The newspaper figures paid no attention to my protests, advancing with the same purposeful gait until they reached their positions around the register. Again, the lead figure gestured toward the cash drawer. Again, I found myself compelled to approach, to reach for the no sale button. And again, the moment I pressed it, the clock reset, and another minute of my memory disappeared into the void. How long had this been going on? Hours? Days? Years? The thought of losing decades to this loop filled me with a terror so complete that I nearly collapsed. I forced myself to think, to look for some escape from this nightmare logic. There had to be a way to break the cycle, some action that would free both me and these impossible visitors from whatever force held us trapped. The answer came to me as I stared at the old inventory ledger Morrison Sr. had always insisted I maintain. Behind the counter, half hidden beneath decades of accumulated grease and dust, was an even older catalog, a bound collection of product listings that predated the computerized system by several generations. I'd seen it countless times but never bothered to examine it closely. Now, with shaking hands, I pulled the catalog from its resting place and began flipping through pages that felt more like leather than paper. The entries were handwritten in fading ink, listing items that no longer existed, leaded gasoline grades, motor oils with names I didn't recognize, additives and treatments that the EPA had probably banned before I was born. And there, on a page near the back, written in handwriting that didn't match any of the other entries, ethereal fuel, 1 gallon, special order, non-returnable. The ink was darker than the surrounding text, as if it had been added recently, but the paper around it was stained and yellowed with age. Below the listing, in the same distinctive handwriting, someone had added a note. For travelers between realms, handle with extreme caution. Do not sell to the living. 12:42. The newspaper figures materialized again, but this time I was ready. Instead of waiting for them to approach the register, I held up the catalog and pointed to the ethereal fuel listing. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The figures stopped moving entirely, their newspaper forms rustling with what might have been surprise or recognition. The lead figure extended what passed for a hand, and I realized it wanted me to complete a transaction. Not a robbery, but a sale. These weren't criminals at all, but customers. Customers who had been trying to make a purchase for 67 years. My voice came out as barely a whisper when I spoke. 1 gallon of ethereal fuel. That'll be... I looked at the catalog, but no price was listed. That'll be everything you have. The newspaper figures began reaching into their forms, producing coins and bills that shared their same flat printed quality. Currency from 1958, probably worthless now, but somehow still legal tender in whatever economy operated between the living and the dead. They placed their payment on the counter with reverent care. I opened the register, not to give them the money inside, but to symbolically complete the transaction. The drawer slid open with its familiar chime, but this time the sound was pure and clean, like a bell tolling the end of a long imprisonment. The newspaper figures began to fade, their forms becoming transparent around the edges. As they dissolved, I could hear something that might have been gratitude, a rustling whisper that spoke of rest and completion, and journeys finally continued. The clock's hands moved forward. 12:43. The cars outside started their engines and pulled away from the pumps, disappearing into the flow of Interstate 5 traffic as if they had never been anything more than ordinary travelers stopping for gas. The temperature began returning to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the station for how long gradually lifted. I looked down at the catalog, expecting to find it blank or aged beyond reading. Instead, the ethereal fuel listing had been crossed out in red ink, just like the entries in Morrison's ledger for October 15th, 1958. Transaction completed. Inventory adjusted. But questions remained. Questions that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness like hungry insects. Had any of this actually happened? Had I just sold an impossible product to customers who had been dead for 67 years? Or was I simply a night shift worker whose mind had finally snapped under the weight of too many solitary hours in a place where time moved differently than the outside world? The station felt normal again, but normal in the way that a broken bone feels normal after the painkillers kick in. The underlying damage was still there, hidden beneath a temporary reprieve. I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. Maybe the newspaper robbers were gone, but whatever force had created them, whatever thin spot in reality allowed the past to bleed through into the present, remained intact. I glanced at the clock. 12:44 a.m. The night was still young, and Interstate 5 stretched endlessly in both directions, carrying travelers whose destinations might not exist on any conventional map. Morrison's Gas and Go stood ready to serve them all, whatever their nature, whatever their needs, even if those needs included ethereal fuel. I returned the catalog to its hiding place behind the counter and tried to convince myself that everything was normal. But deep down, I knew I would be watching the clock tomorrow night, and the night after that, wondering what other impossible customers might materialize at exactly 12:42 a.m. After all, a gas station on Interstate 5 sees all kinds of travelers, even the kind that shouldn't exist. Story 11. The elevator shuddered to a halt at 38, and I knew immediately something was wrong. Not wrong in the way that makes you check your phone or pat your pockets for forgotten keys. Wrong in the way that makes your skin crawl and your breath catch, like stepping into a room where someone just stopped talking about you. The digital display above the elevator buttons flickered between 38 and something else, a symbol I couldn't quite focus on, like trying to read in a dream. I'd been delivering pizza in Seattle for 3 years, and the Meridian Tower construction site had always been straightforward. Concrete dust, hard hats, guys who tipped in crumpled bills and appreciated hot food after 12-hour shifts. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the building felt alive. The doors slid open with a pneumatic wheeze, revealing a corridor that shouldn't exist. I'd been to the 38th floor before, just last week, in fact. It had been a standard construction zone, exposed beams, plastic sheeting, industrial lighting that cast harsh shadows across unfinished drywall. Now, the hallway stretched before me in impossible geometry, folding back on itself in hexagonal patterns that hurt to look at directly. The walls seemed to breathe in my peripheral vision, expanding and contracting like the ribs of some massive sleeping creature. 6 doors lined the corridor, each bearing identical brass placards: 38A, 38B, 38C, 38D, 38E, 38F. The numbers gleamed despite the dim lighting, as if they'd been polished moments before my arrival. Behind each door, I could hear voices, soft, pleading whispers that seemed to seep through the wood like smoke. "The right flavor," they murmured. "Give us the right flavor." I gripped the insulated delivery bag tighter, feeling the weight of 4 large pizzas inside. The order had been unusual from the start. 6 different addresses, all on the same floor, all requesting the flavor that fits. When I'd asked the dispatcher what that meant, she'd gone quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she'd whispered that the customer had been very specific about the wording. The corridor's hexagonal pattern drew my eyes inward, creating an optical illusion that made the floor seem to tilt and shift beneath my feet. Each step forward required conscious effort, as if I were walking through thick water. The air tasted of copper and ozone, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of overripe fruit. I approached 38A first, raising my hand to knock, but the door swung open before my knuckles touched wood. The voice inside was clearer now, a woman's voice, tired and distant. "The right flavor," she said. "Please, I've been waiting so long." The room beyond the threshold was dark, but I could make out the suggestion of furniture, a chair, maybe a table. Something that might have been a person sitting in the shadows, though the proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, or perhaps too thin. I couldn't quite tell. I pulled a pizza box from the bag, checking the receipt taped to the top. Pepperoni and mushroom. Standard enough. I placed it on the floor just inside the doorway, not wanting to step into that darkness. The moment the box touched the ground, I felt the building shift. Not a tremor or settling, but something more fundamental. Like reality had hiccuped. The elevator display, visible through the corridor's impossible angles, now read 38.1. I backed away from 38A, my heart hammering against my ribs. The whispers from the other doors grew louder, more insistent. They overlapped now, creating a symphony of desperate hunger that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. 38B was next. Another door that opened at my approach, another shadow figure in the darkness beyond. This voice was male, deep and resonant, like an echo in a well. "The right flavor," he intoned. "You know what I need." I checked the second box, supreme with extra cheese. My hands shook as I set it down, and again the building shuddered around me. The elevator now read 38.2, and I noticed something else. The numbers on the doors were changing. 38A had become 38A1, and 38B was now 38B2. By the time I reached 38C, sweat was soaking through my uniform shirt despite the chill in the air. The whispers had grown to a constant murmur, like prayers in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood. They spoke of hunger, not for food, but for something deeper, something essential. The third pizza, Hawaiian with Canadian bacon, disappeared into the darkness beyond 38C, and the building climbed another decimal point. 38.3. The corridor seemed longer now, the hexagonal pattern more complex. New doors appeared in the spaces between the original 6, bearing labels like 38A, 1.1, and 38B, 2.3. The brass plaques multiplied like cells dividing, each one gleaming with that same impossible polish. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to abandon the remaining pizzas and sprint for the elevator. But something held me in place. Not fear exactly, but a terrible certainty that running would make things worse. That the building would grow around me, sprouting new floors and fractional levels until I was lost in an infinite regression of numbered doors and hungry whispers. The fourth pizza went to 38D, veggie lovers with extra olives. As I placed it down, the shadow figure inside spoke more clearly than the others. "You understand now," it said, and I could hear the smile in its voice. "You see what this place is becoming." The elevator read 38.4, and I watched in numb horror as new corridors branched off from the main hallway. Each one led to more doors, more numbers, more fractional subdivisions of space that shouldn't exist. 38D, 1.7, 38A, 3.2, 38F. I had 2 pizzas left, and 2 doors remaining, 38E and 38F. The whispers from 38E were different, younger voices speaking in overlapping syllables that might have been my name, or might have been pleas for help. I couldn't tell anymore. The distinction between sound and meaning had begun to blur, like trying to focus on something seen through water. The fifth pizza, meat lovers with extra sauce, joined its predecessors in the darkness beyond 38E. The building climbed to 38.5, and I watched the original corridor fragment into geometric impossibilities. Walls folded in on themselves, creating spaces that existed in the gaps between spaces. The air grew thick with the smell of cheese and something else. Something organic and wrong. Only 38F remained. I stood before the final door, the last pizza burning cold against my hands through the insulated bag. The placard read 38F, but as I watched, the letters shifted and changed. The F became something else, a symbol that hurt to look at, a character from no alphabet I recognized. Mathematical notation, perhaps, representing the point where whole numbers broke down into infinite subdivision. 38FU. The whisper from beyond this door was my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. The right flavor, it said. Give me the right flavor, and everything stops. I knew with absolute certainty that placing the sixth pizza would trap me here, that the building would climb to 38.6, then 38.7, then beyond, spiraling up through decimal places that had no end. I would become another shadow figure behind another door, whispering for the right flavor from visitors who might never come. But I also knew that not delivering the pizza would be worse. The hungry voices would grow louder, the corridors would continue to multiply, and eventually, the building would fragment into so many pieces that even the concept of escape would become meaningless. I set down the final pizza, a custom order with toppings I didn't recognize, ingredients that seemed to shift and change each time I tried to focus on them. The moment it touched the ground, the building sighed like a creature settling into sleep. The elevator display flickered and went dark. I ran, through corridors that folded and unfolded around me, past doors that opened and closed like breathing. The whispers followed, speaking my name now, telling me to stay, to join them, to understand what they understood. The floor numbers blurred past, 38F.1, 38F.2, climbing toward something that wasn't quite 39 but wasn't quite anything else either. I reached the elevator and hammered the call button. Nothing happened. The display remained dark, the shaft silent. I could hear the building growing above me, new floors sprouting like branches from a diseased tree. 38.6, 38.7, 38.8, the service elevator. I'd forgotten about the service elevator. I found it through pure instinct, following maintenance signs that flickered between English and those same impossible symbols. The service elevator was older, smaller, with a manual gate that scraped against metal tracks. Its display was analog, physical numbers that couldn't shift or change. It read 38, solid and reassuring. I yanked the gate closed and hit the button for ground level. The elevator lurched downward, and through the shaft walls, I could hear the building continuing to grow above me. More voices, more doors, more fractional subdivisions of space and hunger. 37, 36, 35. The numbers counted down like a countdown to sanity. With each floor, the whispers grew fainter, the impossible geometry less oppressive. By the 20th floor, I could almost convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and too many late shifts. Almost. But when I reached the ground floor and stumbled out into the Seattle night, I could still hear them, faint but persistent, like tinnitus in reverse. The hungry voices from the fractional floors, still whispering for the right flavor, still waiting. I quit that job the next morning, telling my boss I was moving out of state for family reasons. I never drove past the Meridian Tower again, never looked up its address online, never tried to explain what had happened on the 38th floor. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I hear them again, the whispers. And I wonder if somewhere in that building, in rooms that exist between rooms, shadow figures are still waiting for someone to deliver the right flavor, still hoping that the next visitor will understand what they need, still counting up through decimal places that have no end. The strangest part is that I never collected payment for those pizzas, never turned in my receipts or explained the missing inventory. It was as if the delivery had never officially happened, as if the building had consumed not just the food, but the very record of the transaction. Yet the taste lingers, sweet and wrong, like overripe fruit. And sometimes, when I pass a construction site or see an unfinished building against the Seattle skyline, I catch myself counting floors, wondering if they go higher than they should, wondering if somewhere in their fractional spaces, new voices are learning to whisper for the right flavor. The receipt from that night is still in my car's glove compartment. I can't bring myself to throw it away. though I've never had the courage to read it carefully. The last time I glanced at it, the addresses seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, the numbers rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to contemplate. 38A through 38FU. I've never been sure if I escaped that building or if it simply finished with me. If somewhere above the clouds, past the point where Seattle's skyline makes sense, those floors are still climbing through their decimal progression. Still growing, still waiting, still hungry for the right flavor. Story 12. The fluorescent lights in the Civic Center's underground parking garage had always flickered with an irregular pulse, casting shadows that seemed to breathe against the concrete walls. I'd worked late again, the third time this week, and my footsteps echoed through the cavernous space with the hollow resonance of a tomb. The air hung thick with the scent of motor oil and something else, something metallic that made my teeth ache. My Honda sat in the far corner, isolated under a dying light that painted everything in sickly yellow hues. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional ping of cooling engines. I fumbled with my keys, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had begun to feel more suffocating with each passing night. That's when I heard it. A sound like thunder, but muffled, as if filtered through layers of cotton and concrete. The noise rolled through the garage, reverberating off the support pillars and causing paint chips to rain down like snow. I froze, keys suspended halfway to the lock, every nerve ending suddenly alert. The second impact came with more force, and this time I felt it in my chest. A compression that made my ribs ache. Hairline cracks appeared along the nearest concrete pillar, spiderwebbing outward from some invisible point of contact. The overhead light above my car began to swing gently, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the fixture's motion. I should have left then. Should have run to my car and driven away without looking back. Instead, I found myself walking toward the source of the disturbance, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the renewed silence, each one announcing my presence to whatever waited in the shadows. The third strike nearly brought me to my knees. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, experienced, absorbed into my bones until my skeleton vibrated like a tuning fork. More cracks appeared on the walls, and now I could see where they were coming from. In the center of the garage, beneath a cluster of working lights, three shapes moved with predatory precision around something that shouldn't have existed. The figures were wrong in every way that mattered. They possessed human proportions, but carried themselves with an uncanny fluidity, as if gravity affected them differently. Their movements left brief after-images in my peripheral vision, dark smears against the concrete that vanished when I tried to focus on them directly. They circled their target with choreographed violence, taking turns to deliver blows that echoed through the structure like the heartbeat of some massive, dying thing. And their victim, the translucent figure, cowered in the center of their circle, composed entirely of what appeared to be blue smoke or mist. It possessed a vaguely human shape, though the edges blurred and shifted with each impact. When the shadow struck, the blue form contracted, condensing into a more solid appearance before dispersing again, like smoke from a snuffed candle. Each blow caused the thing to emit a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like air being forced through broken pipes, wet and desperate and utterly inhuman. I pressed myself against a concrete pillar, feeling the rough surface bite into my palms. The cracks that had appeared after each impact were spreading, creating an intricate network of fissures that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. As I watched, transfixed by the impossible scene, I began to notice other details that made my throat constrict with fear. The three attackers weren't just beating their victim, they were performing a ritual. Their movements followed a precise pattern, each strike timed to coincide with what sounded like a heartbeat, echoing from somewhere deep within the garage's infrastructure. The rhythm was slow and irregular, like an arrhythmic heart struggling to maintain life. Ba-dump. Ba-dump. Pause. Ba-dump-dump. The blue figure pulsed in time with this heartbeat, growing brighter with each beat and dimming as the attackers struck. I realized with growing horror that I was witnessing something that had happened before, perhaps many times before. The cracks in the concrete, the way the shadows moved with practiced precision, the rhythmic nature of the violence. This was a replay, an echo of events burned so deeply into this place that they had become part of its structure. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, though I wasn't sure who I would call or what I would say. The screen's glow seemed impossibly bright in the dimness, and I had to squint to see the display. No signal. Of course there was no signal. The underground location should have explained it, but something about the way the signal bars faded to nothing felt deliberate, as if the garage itself was preventing outside communication. The heartbeat grew stronger, more insistent, and I felt my own pulse beginning to synchronize with it. Ba-dump, ba-dump, pause, ba-dump, dump. Each beat sent a tremor through my chest, and I noticed that the cracks in the pillar beside me were beginning to glow with a faint blue light, the same shade as the translucent victim. I had to get closer. The compulsion hit me like a physical force, dragging me forward despite every instinct screaming at me to run. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the impossible scene with the jerky gait of a marionette. With each step, the details became clearer and more disturbing. The attackers weren't just shadows. They were absences, negative spaces where light went to die. When they moved, they left brief wounds in reality, dark tears that revealed glimpses of something vast and hungry beyond. Their victim's suffering wasn't just physical. With each blow, portions of the blue figure's essence were torn away and absorbed into those dark wounds, feeding whatever waited on the other side. The heartbeat was deafening now, drowning out my own thoughts and making my vision pulse in rhythm with its cadence. I was perhaps 20 feet away when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The blue figure had turned to look at me. Its face was a sketch drawn in smoke and desperation, features that shifted and reformed with each breath. But the eyes, God, the eyes were constant. They held intelligence, awareness, and a pleading that transcended language. It was trying to tell me something, mouthing words that I couldn't hear over the thunderous heartbeat. That's when I understood. The victim wasn't just being attacked. It was being trapped, held in an endless loop of violence that fed on its suffering. And now, somehow, it knew I could see it. The realization hit me with the force of revelation. This wasn't just a replay. It was a prison. I took another step forward, and one of the shadow attackers paused mid-strike. Its absence of a head turned toward me, and I felt the weight of its attention like ice water flooding my nervous system. The thing that wasn't there studied me with senses I couldn't comprehend, and I had the terrifying certainty that it was deciding whether I belonged in this scene. The blue figure's mouth moved more frantically, and this time I caught fragments of words carried on the underground wind. The cars, rhythm, brake, the cycle, cars. I looked around the garage with new understanding, seeing the vehicles parked throughout the space not as mere transportation but as instruments. Each one had a horn, a voice that could cut through the oppressive atmosphere. The victim was trying to tell me how to help, how to disrupt whatever force kept it trapped in this endless repetition of violence. But the shadow attackers had noticed me now. All three turned in my direction, their movements synchronized and predatory. Where their attention focused, the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming hard to breathe. The cracks in the concrete began spreading faster, reaching toward me like grasping fingers, and I realized with mounting dread that I was in danger of becoming part of this replay myself. I could feel it happening, a tugging sensation that started in my chest and spread outward. The garage was trying to incorporate me into its twisted narrative, to make me either another victim or another attacker. The choice wasn't mine to make. The scene would cast me in whatever role would feed its hunger most efficiently. Fighting against the compulsion that urged me to either flee or attack, I stumbled toward the nearest parked car, a burgundy sedan with keys still dangling from the door handle. The owner had probably stepped away for just a moment, never suspecting that their brief absence would provide me with salvation. I yanked the door open and slammed my hand against the horn. The sound that emerged wasn't the sharp honk I expected, but something deeper, more resonant. It cut through the garage's atmosphere like a blade, causing the shadow attackers to pause and the blue figure to brighten suddenly. The cracks in the concrete stopped spreading, and for a moment, the heartbeat faltered. But it wasn't enough. The shadows regrouped quickly, their attention returning to their victim with renewed fury. I realized that a single horn blast wouldn't break a cycle that had been repeating for who knows how long. I needed to match the rhythm, to create a counter pattern that would disrupt the supernatural machinery keeping the scene locked in place. Ba-dump. Ba-dump. Pause. Ba-dump-dump. I pressed the horn in time with the heartbeat, adding my voice to the garage's twisted song. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The blue figure began to pulse more brightly, and the shadow attacker's movements became jerky and uncertain, but the effort required was enormous. I could feel the garage fighting against my interference, pushing back with a force that made my head pound and my vision blur. Other cars. I needed other cars. Abandoning the sedan, I ran to a nearby pickup truck. The door was unlocked, and I leaned on its horn, adding a second voice to my improvised symphony. Then a third car, and a fourth, each horn adding another layer to the cacophony that was slowly but surely disrupting the replay. The shadow attackers were losing cohesion now, their forms beginning to fray at the edges. The blue figure was growing brighter and more solid, and for the first time since I'd entered this nightmare, I heard it speak in a voice like wind through broken glass. Thank you. But as the scene began to dissolve, as the shadows finally released their grip on their victim, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The cracks in the concrete weren't healing. They were spreading to me. Thin lines of blue light began appearing on my hands and arms, not painful, but definitely there, definitely real. The blue figure was fading now, finally free to move on to whatever waited beyond this concrete prison. But its eyes met mine one last time, and in them I saw not gratitude, but pity. As it dissolved completely, taking with it the shadows and the oppressive atmosphere, I was left alone in a normal parking garage with normal lighting and normal silence, except for the blue lines that now decorated my skin like a tattoo made of lightning. I drove home in a daze, checking my rearview mirror constantly for signs that I was being followed. The blue marks faded by morning, but I could still feel them beneath my skin, a network of scars that marked me as someone who had interfered with forces beyond his understanding. The next day, I looked up unsolved crimes in the Civic Center area. There had been an assault in that garage 3 years ago, a man beaten by unknown attackers and left for dead. He survived, but the case was never solved. The victim, according to the newspaper article, was named Marcus Chen, and he had been found unconscious near the center of the garage with injuries that didn't quite match any known weapon. He'd recovered physically, the article said, but friends reported that he was never quite the same afterward. He'd developed severe insomnia and an irrational fear of underground spaces. 6 months after the attack, he'd moved to another state. I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed was some kind of stress-induced hallucination, a product of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But the blue marks on my skin told a different story, and every time I descended into any underground parking area, I could feel them warming, responding to something that ordinary people couldn't perceive. The worst part isn't the marks themselves, or even the knowledge that I've somehow become connected to whatever supernatural infrastructure exists beneath the surface of our everyday world. The worst part is the growing certainty that what I witnessed wasn't unique. Every building has shadows. Every parking garage has dark corners where fluorescent lights flicker and paint cracks for no apparent reason. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the city, I catch glimpses in my peripheral vision of blue figures standing in those shadows, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to see them clearly. Most people walk past without noticing, protected by their inability to perceive what hides in plain sight. But I can see them now, and they can see me. The marks on my skin are spreading. Story 13. The invitation came through an old friend from art school, Marcus, whose family owned one of those sprawling Garden District mansions that tourists paid $20 just to photograph from the sidewalk. The house party was supposed to be intimate, he said. Just a handful of graduate students from Tulane celebrating the end of midterms. I should have known better. Nothing in New Orleans stays intimate for long. The October evening hung thick with humidity that seemed to press against my skin like invisible hands. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees created shifting shadows that danced in the amber glow of gas lamps lining the cobblestone streets. My camera bag felt heavier than usual as I walked toward the Beauregard mansion, its antebellum columns rising like pale sentinels against the darkening sky. The house had been built in 1847, Marcus had told me once, by a sugar plantation owner whose fortune evaporated after the Civil War. Since then, it had passed through various hands, most recently serving as a boarding house for artists and students. The current residents paid below-market rent in exchange for maintaining the property's historic character, though I suspected the real reason landlords struggled to keep tenants was the house's peculiar atmosphere. Even in daylight, shadows seemed to linger in corners where they shouldn't, and mirrors reflected things that weren't quite there. Music drifted from the open windows as I approached, not the typical college party soundtrack, but something older, more ethereal. String instruments wove together in a melody that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The front door stood ajar, revealing a foyer lit by an enormous crystal chandelier that threw prismatic patterns across peeling wallpaper. Inside, the air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp that made the back of my throat itch. Students clustered in small groups throughout the parlor, their conversations creating a low murmur that never quite resolved into distinct words. They moved with an odd fluidity, as if underwater, their gestures graceful but somehow disconnected from normal human rhythm. Marcus found me near the grand staircase, his usually animated face strangely serene. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, but his skin seemed to glow with an unnatural luminescence. He embraced me with enthusiasm that felt forced, his grip lingering longer than comfortable. "You made it," he said, though his voice sounded distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "I wasn't sure you'd come. You've been so selective about social events lately." I had been avoiding parties, actually. My last few photography assignments had left me feeling disconnected, like I was observing life through a viewfinder even when the camera wasn't in my hands. The constant focus on capturing perfect moments had started to feel predatory, intrusive. But Marcus didn't need to know that. He guided me deeper into the house, past rooms where students sat in circles on Persian rugs, their phones casting blue light on faces that seemed too perfect, too symmetrical. Everyone looked like they'd stepped out of an Instagram filter, skin flawless, eyes impossibly bright, features sharp enough to cut glass. The disconnect between their beauty and their listless expressions created an uncanny valley effect that made my skin crawl. In the main parlor, a grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its pendulum swinging with metronomic precision. The clock face showed 10:47, though something about the Roman numerals seemed wrong. They shifted slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, like words on a page swimming in peripheral vision. "Everyone's been asking about your work," Marcus continued, steering me toward a group gathered around an ornate mirror that reflected the room in strange angles. "The portraits you did for the art magazine, they're incredible, so raw, so honest. People here are dying to work with you." The word dying hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. I studied the faces around us more carefully. Each person looked flawless, but flawed in identical ways. The same artificial glow, the same too-perfect symmetry, the same hollow expression behind their enhanced features. Near the mirror, a girl with platinum hair was showing her phone to others, swiping through photos of herself that seemed to move independently of her finger gestures. In each image, her reflection appeared slightly different, posing, smiling, even winking at the camera while she remained completely still. Other students crowded around, their own phones displaying similar impossible photographs. "What kind of app is that?" I asked, moving closer. The girl looked up with eyes that seemed to reflect light like a cat's. "It's not an app," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that didn't match the movement of her lips. "It's so much better. Want to try some?" She held out her hand, palm cupped around a small pile of silvery powder that sparkled like crushed diamonds. The metallic scent grew stronger, making my sinuses burn. Around us, other students were taking pinches of the substance, inhaling it through rolled bills or simply pressing it to their nostrils with their fingers. Glamour dust, the girl explained, though I hadn't asked. It shows you who you really are, who you could be, the version of yourself that exists in perfect light, at the perfect angle, with the perfect expression. And then, she gestured toward her phone, where her reflection now stood completely separate from her body, moving independently within the frame. Then it makes it real. I watched in fascination and growing horror as the digital version of herself turned to face the camera directly, even though the real girl was looking at me. The phone screen showed her reflection stepping closer to what should have been the mirror's surface, pressing its hands against the glass from the inside. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Augmented reality technology had advanced rapidly, but this seemed beyond current capabilities. The movement was too fluid, too natural. The reflected version cast shadows that fell in directions that didn't match the room's lighting. And there was something in its eyes, an intelligence that seemed separate from the girl holding the phone. How does it work? I heard myself ask. Nobody really knows, Marcus said, appearing beside me with his own phone. On his screen, his reflection was adjusting a collar that the real Marcus wasn't wearing. Someone brought it to a party last month, said they got it from a vendor at the French market, but when people went looking, nobody could find the stall. The effects are transformative. He inhaled a pinch of the powder, and immediately his reflection in his phone began moving more dramatically, straightening posture, adjusting hair, practicing different smiles. Within moments, the digital Marcus looked like a professional headshot, confident, charismatic, flawless. The real Marcus, meanwhile, stood swaying slightly, his pupils dilated to pinpoints. Around the room, more students were taking photos of themselves, and with each flash, their reflections seemed to gain more independence. Some were now having conversations with their phone screens, talking to versions of themselves that responded with different voices, different expressions, different personalities entirely. The pendulum clock chimed 11 times, its sound reverberating through the house with unnatural resonance. On the 11th chime, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The reflected figures in everyone's phones suddenly turned to look directly outward, as if they'd all heard something the rest of us hadn't. "They're getting stronger," the platinum-haired girl whispered, her voice tinged with excitement and fear. "Each photo feeds them. Each like, each share, each view gives them more presence. Soon they won't need the screens anymore." As if summoned by her words, one of the phone screens began to bulge outward, the glass stretching like rubber. A hand pressed against the surface from the inside, fingers splaying against what should have been solid matter. The student holding the phone, a nervous-looking guy with thick glasses, dropped it in shock. The device clattered to the floor, screen side down, but I could still hear muffled sounds coming from underneath it, like someone trapped in a small space and trying to break free. My photographer's instincts kicked in before my rational mind could stop them. I pulled out my camera and fired off several shots in rapid succession. The dropped phone, the students' shocked faces, the mirror that now showed reflections moving independently of their sources. Through my viewfinder, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Shadows cast by people who weren't there. Faces in mirrors that belonged to no one in the room. Silvery powder floating in the air like glitter suspended in honey. The moment my camera's flash fired, every reflected figure in every phone screen turned to look directly at me. Their expressions shifted from vacant perfection to something predatory, hungry. They began pressing against their respective screens with increasing urgency, and I realized with growing dread that they all looked exactly like their real-world counterparts, but enhanced, idealized, and completely without the hesitation or humanity that marked the originals. "Delete those," Marcus said, his voice now carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Delete them right now." But I couldn't move. Through my camera's LCD screen, I could see that my photos had captured something impossible. The reflected figures were now partially emerging from the phones, translucent forms pulling themselves through glass that bent and stretched like liquid. They moved with purpose, reaching toward their physical counterparts with expressions of possessive longing. The grandfather clock began chiming again, though its hands still showed 11:15. One chime. The sound seemed to come from inside my skull, reverberating through my bones. Around the room, students were backing away from their phones as their idealized selves pushed further through the screens. Two chimes. The platinum-haired girl's reflection had emerged to its waist, reaching toward the real girl with arms that looked too long, too graceful, too perfect. Other reflected figures were following suit, some nearly completely free of their digital prisons. "They want to replace us," someone whispered, though I couldn't tell who. "They want our lives, our bodies, our existence. They're us, but better, and they know it." The third chime was building, and I understood instinctively that when it finished, something irreversible would happen. My finger found the delete button on my camera. The first photo disappeared, and immediately one of the emerging figures flickered, becoming less solid. I deleted another, then another, working frantically as the chime seemed to stretch on forever, resonating through the house like a death knell. The reflected beings were all looking at me now, their perfect faces twisted with rage and desperation. They understood what I was doing. Several had pulled themselves completely free and were moving across the room toward me, their movements too smooth, too coordinated, like they were gliding rather than walking. My camera's battery indicator was flashing red, but I kept deleting, each removed image causing one of the approaching figures to flicker and fade. The students around me had gone silent, watching with expressions of horror and fascination as their idealized selves dissolved back into digital fragments. The third chime finally ended, and silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. The last of the reflected figures had vanished, leaving only empty phone screens and the original students, who now looked pale and somehow diminished, as if part of them had been drained away. But as I lowered my camera, I caught my own reflection in the ornate mirror across the room. For just a moment, my reflection wasn't quite synchronized with my movements. It smiled while I frowned, straightened its posture while I slumped with exhaustion, and looked directly into my eyes with an expression of patient hunger. Then it matched my movements perfectly again, and I was left wondering if I'd seen anything at all. Marcus touched my shoulder, his hand trembling. "Thank you," he said, though his voice sounded hollow. "I think you saved us from something, though I'm not entirely sure what." Neither was I. As I packed up my camera and prepared to leave, I noticed that every student in the room kept stealing glances at their darkened phone screens, expressions of longing and loss on their faces. They'd tasted perfection, even if it had been artificial, and now they were left with their merely human selves. The grandfather clock showed 11:59 as I walked toward the door, its pendulum swinging in perfect rhythm. In its reflection, I caught a glimpse of someone walking beside me, someone who looked exactly like me, but carried himself with more confidence, more purpose, more life. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. Outside, the New Orleans night felt different, heavier, more watchful. As I walked away from the mansion, I could swear I heard the faint sound of camera shutters clicking from behind every darkened window, capturing images of things that shouldn't exist, creating digital spaces for reflections that were growing hungrier with each flash of light. My own phone felt warm in my pocket, its weight somehow more significant than before. I didn't dare look at the screen, afraid of what I might see looking back. Because deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I wondered if deleting those photos had really solved anything, or if it had simply taught something patient and perfect how to hide better, how to wait for the right moment to emerge from whatever digital space it now called home. The Spanish moss whispered secrets in languages I didn't understand, and somewhere in the distance a clock chimed midnight with a sound like breaking glass. Story 14. The Mojave Desert swallows sound like a hungry mouth. At 3 in the morning, my Honda's engine thrums against the vast silence, its monotonous rhythm the only proof I haven't fallen into some cosmic void. The interstate stretches ahead like a black ribbon, illuminated by my headlights for maybe 50 yards before dissolving into nothingness. Stars pierce the sky with surgical precision, cold and distant as pinpricks in black velvet. I've been driving for 6 hours straight, fleeing the wreckage of my marriage, my job, my entire goddamn life in Los Angeles. The desert promised anonymity, a place to disappear until I figured out what came next. But somewhere between Barstow and nowhere, the emptiness began to feel less like freedom and more like a trap. The first sign something was wrong came when I glanced in my rearview mirror. A vehicle followed me, maybe a quarter-mile back, no headlights. Just a dark shape moving against the darker landscape, visible only when moonlight caught its windshield like a silver eye. I pressed the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb from 70 to 85, but the distance between us remained constant. When I eased off the gas, so did my shadow. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, leather growing slick with sweat despite the air conditioning. I told myself it was another late-night traveler, maybe someone with busted headlights trying to use my taillights as a guide. People did crazy things in the desert. Reasonable explanations existed for everything. But reasonable explanations didn't account for what happened when I touched the brakes. The first time was just a tap. A semi-trailer had appeared in my headlights, moving slow in the right lane. As my foot pressed the brake pedal, the dashboard erupted in blue light. The speedometer, fuel gauge, and temperature readings vanished, replaced by a series of numbers that made no sense. 34 degree 47 12.8, and 116 D 2345 7W. GPS coordinates, but when I glanced at my phone's navigation, the screen showed only static. The coordinates flickered for 3 seconds, then the normal gauges returned as if nothing had happened. In my mirror, the dark vehicle had moved closer, close enough that I could make out its boxy shape. An old Suburban or Tahoe, maybe from the 90s. Still no headlights, but it rode my bumper with unnatural confidence, as if the driver possessed night vision. I accelerated again, this time pushing past 90. The speedometer needle climbed steadily, but something else caught my attention. The tachometer. Among the usual red markings indicating engine RPM, a thin blue line had appeared at exactly 2,847 RPM. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat made of light. The desert around me began to change, though in ways so subtle I almost missed them. The scrub brush and Joshua trees seemed to lean inward, as if the landscape itself was tilting toward the road. My headlights, which had been cutting clear white cones through the darkness, now carried an almost imperceptible blue tint. When I rolled down the window to get some air, the wind carried a metallic taste, like copper pennies dissolving on my tongue. That's when I saw the sign. It stood alone on the right shoulder, weathered and bullet-scarred like every other desert highway marker, but the reflective letters spelled out something impossible. Blue Road, next right. Below it, in smaller text, authorized travelers only. There was no right turn. The interstate continued straight for miles in both directions, with nothing but empty desert on either side. Yet as I drove past the sign, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a road that shouldn't exist, branching off into the darkness like a pale scar across the landscape. I pressed the brake again, harder this time. The blue coordinates flashed across my dashboard, different numbers but still meaningless to my GPS. 34 degree, 5 Felmadu, 18.1 N, 116 to 31, 22, 9W. As the display faded, I felt something I can only describe as a gentle tug, as if invisible hands were adjusting my steering wheel by degrees. The vehicle behind me had closed the gap to maybe 50 feet. Now I could see it clearly in my mirror, a dark green Suburban with tinted windows and no license plate. The moonlight revealed scratches and dents across its surface, battle scars from countless desert journeys. But what made my stomach clench was the driver. I couldn't see his face, just a silhouette behind the wheel, perfectly still, too still, like a mannequin posed in a driving position, hands at 10 and 2, head facing forward with mechanical precision. Even at 90 miles per hour on a bumpy desert highway, he never moved, never adjusted his position. never so much as turned his head. My fuel gauge read 3/4 full, but I was running out of options. The next town was Prim, still 40 miles away, and something told me I wouldn't make it that far. Not at this rate. Not with whatever was happening to my car, my dashboard, my perception of reality itself. I forced myself to think logically. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Stress manifested in strange ways. The coordinates might be some kind of dashboard malfunction, the blue tachometer marking just a reflection from the moon. The vehicle behind me, well, that was real enough, but harmless. Probably. But logic crumbled when I saw the second sign. Blue Road, 1 mile. This time I looked more carefully as I passed, turning my head to peer into the darkness beyond the shoulder. The road was there, no question about it. A narrow strip of asphalt that seemed to glow with its own faint luminescence, curving away from the interstate in a gentle arc that defied the desert's natural geography. No guardrails, no reflectors, no painted lines, just smooth pavement that looked newly laid despite the complete absence of construction equipment or workers. The tug came stronger now, a persistent pressure that made holding the steering wheel feel like fighting against a powerful current. My Honda wanted to veer right, toward that impossible exit, and it took genuine effort to keep us pointed straight ahead. The blue mark on my tachometer pulsed faster, and I realized with growing dread that my engine RPMs were slowly climbing to match it. 2,147 and rising. I tried to slow down, but my foot felt like it was pushing against concrete. The brake pedal had maybe an inch of give before becoming completely rigid. The speedometer held steady at 93 miles per hour, but the engine note was changing, rising in pitch as the RPMs climbed toward that blue line. In my mirror, the Suburban's driver finally moved. His head turned slowly, mechanically, until he was looking directly at me through our respective rear windows. Even at 90 miles per hour in near total darkness, I could see his eyes, or rather the absence of them. Just smooth, dark sockets in a face that might have been human once, but now resembled something carved from stone. The coordinates flashed again, longer this time. 34 to Guy B6, 43.7 and 116 and 38, 55, 2W. When they faded, my GPS screen showed something new, a thin blue line extending from my current position toward an unmarked destination to the northeast. The blue road, mapped in real time by electronics that shouldn't be capable of such precision. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What the hell do you want?" The answer came not from the faceless driver behind me, but from my own dashboard. The radio, which had been silent since losing the last FM signal 50 miles back, crackled to life with a voice like distant thunder. "Maintain speed. Follow the blue line. Deviation results in permanent displacement." The third sign appeared in my headlights. Blue road. Next right. Last chance. This time I could see the exit clearly, a perfect off-ramp that curved away into a landscape that didn't match the surrounding desert. Instead of scrub brush and cacti, tall grass swayed in the headlight spill, and beyond that, structures that might have been buildings or might have been something else entirely. The pavement itself seemed to ripple like water, and the air above it shimmered with heat distortion despite the cool night temperature. My tachometer needle touched the blue line, 2,147 RPM exactly, and suddenly the pressure on my steering wheel doubled. The Honda lurched toward the exit as if yanked by a massive magnet. I fought to stay on the interstate, muscles straining, but the pull was irresistible. The exit rushed toward me like a mouth opening to swallow. At the last possible second, I made a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. I floored the accelerator. The Honda's engine screamed, RPMs soaring past the blue line into the red zone. The mysterious pull weakened, became manageable, and I was able to steer back toward the interstate's center line. In my mirror, the Suburban fell back, growing smaller and dimmer until it was just another shadow among shadows. But my relief was short-lived. The radio spoke again, clearer now, almost conversational. "Unacceptable deviation detected. Initiating correction protocol." The asphalt ahead began to change color, shifting from black to deep blue to brilliant azure. The painted yellow lines dissolved, replaced by markings that pulsed with their own light. My headlights revealed a landscape that no longer resembled the Mojave Desert, rolling hills covered in vegetation I couldn't identify, buildings that seemed to shift and flow like liquid architecture, a sky that flickered between starry black and deep purple. I was on the blue road whether I'd chosen it or not. The speedometer ceased to function, its needle spinning wildly before settling at a meaningless position between 0 and infinity. Only the tachometer maintained accuracy, its blue line pulsing in rhythm with something I gradually recognized as my own heartbeat. As long as I kept the engine RPMs matched to that line, the road remained solid beneath my tires. Any variation, faster or slower, and I could feel the pavement beginning to soften, becoming less real, threatening to dissolve entirely and dump me into whatever lay beyond the edges of this impossible highway. Time moved strangely here. My dashboard clock had stopped at 3:33 a.m., but I'd been driving for what felt like hours, or maybe minutes, or maybe years. The landscape outside shifted constantly, sometimes desert, sometimes forest, sometimes urban sprawl that looked almost familiar, but contained buildings I'd never seen before. Street signs flashed past in languages that weren't quite English, offering directions to destinations that existed only in the spaces between reality's cracks. The fuel gauge still read 3/4 full, despite the engine running hard for an impossible duration. The temperature gauge held steady in the normal range, though I could feel heat radiating from the dashboard in waves that tasted of ozone and copper. My phone had lost all signal, its screen showing only static, but occasionally I caught glimpses of text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Welcome to the between. Keep driving. Don't look in the mirror. I looked anyway. The Suburban was back, but not alone this time. A convoy of vehicles stretched behind me. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even what looked like a horse-drawn wagon from another century entirely. All moving at exactly the same speed, all maintaining perfect distance, all driven by figures that sat too still and moved too rarely to be human. And all of them were looking at me. The radio whispered secrets and voices I almost recognized. My ex-wife warning me about the dangers of driving tired. My dead father offering directions to a place called home. My own voice from what might have been tomorrow or yesterday, explaining that the blue road only appeared to those who needed to disappear. I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that I might have been wrong about fleeing to the desert. Maybe the desert had been calling me all along. Maybe every wrong turn in my life had been leading toward this moment, this choice, this road that existed in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The blue line on my tachometer pulsed faster now, demanding more RPMs, more speed, more commitment to this journey that had no GPS coordinates and no destination marked on any map. I could feel the engine straining, could smell burning oil and overheated metal, but stopping wasn't an option. Slowing down meant sinking through the pavement into whatever hungry darkness waited below. Hours passed, or maybe seconds. The convoy behind me grew longer, stretching back into infinity. New vehicles joined from side roads that hadn't existed moments before. Delivery trucks with no company logos, school buses with blackened windows, luxury cars that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades, but still ran with mechanical precision. All of us trapped on the blue road, maintaining speed, following the pulse of that hypnotic blue line, traveling toward a destination that might not exist or might be the only real place left in a world gone mad with loneliness and loss. The radio fell silent. The landscape outside my window settled into something that might have been the Mojave Desert again, but cleaner somehow, more perfect, like a photograph of what the desert should look like rather than what it actually was. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that astronomers had never cataloged, and the horizon line wavered like a mirage in reverse. I drove on, because stopping wasn't a choice anymore. The blue line had become my heartbeat, my breath, my only connection to whatever remained of sanity in this space between worlds. Behind me, the convoy followed with mechanical patience, waiting for me to make the same discovery they had all made eventually. That some roads, once taken, lead only forward. That some destinations can't be reached, only arrived at. That sometimes the only way to find yourself is to become completely, irreversibly lost. The tachometer's blue line pulsed once more, brighter than before, and in that moment I understood that I'd been wrong about everything. I hadn't stumbled onto the blue road by accident. I'd been driving it my entire life, making choices that had always led here, to this moment of perfect clarity in the endless desert night. The speedometer finally settled on a number that made no sense, and I drove on because what else was there to do? The fuel gauge still read 3/4 full,